Daenerys Targaryen had once stood on the scorched plains of the Dothraki Sea, surrounded by a khalasar that only followed her because she had been Khal Drogo's wife, then because she had birthed dragons into the world. She had been a Khaleesi, a breaker of chains, and a liberator of slaves along the coasts of Slaver's Bay. Her fate, she had once believed, would lead her inexorably back across the narrow sea to claim the Iron Throne in her own name, as the last rightful scion of House Targaryen. Yet fate, twisted and sly as a cat in the shadows, would steer her path differently than she had ever imagined. In time, that path wound itself around the figure of Jaime Lannister, the Golden Knight with the bright green eyes and the infamous moniker, Kingslayer. The story of how Daenerys Targaryen came to marry Jaime Lannister was woven from a patchwork of betrayals and alliances, from losses so staggering they nearly toppled her spirit, and from a surprising turn of events in the Seven Kingdoms. Still in Meereen, she had been nursing her wounds after the troubles that plagued her rule. She had locked away 2 of her dragons to prevent them from harming her people, and the third, Drogon, had flown free, wild and temperamental, scorning even his mother's attempts at control. The sons of the Harpy had begun to plague the streets, and war threatened on every side. For every slave she freed, new enemies arose. Much like the Hydra of old tales, each time one foe's head was severed, another would appear to strike at her from an unexpected angle. And yet across the sea in Westeros, a shift in power was brewing. King Tommen sat on the Iron Throne, but it was his mother, Cersei Lannister, who prowled the red wastes of the throne room with cold fury in her heart. Lord Tywin had died ignominiously on the privy, shot through by his estranged son, Tyrion, who had subsequently fled the capital. The realm found itself at a crossroads, uncertain of who truly held power behind the Boy King's mild gaze. Margaery Tyrell hovered near the throne as queen consort, and the faith militant had begun its reemergence, setting everyone's nerves on edge. Jaime Lannister, for his part, had been dispatched to the Riverlands at one point, attempting to bring the remnants of the Tully forces to heel. The war had ground on, though its sharpest fangs had been drawn. The War of the Five Kings was tapering off, and the kingdoms, exhausted, hungered, humiliated, craved respite. Yet rumors of Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, had begun to filter across the narrow sea to roost in the ears of those still astute enough to sense danger. Whispers told of 3 dragons growing larger by the day, of an army of Unsullied, of freedmen swelling her ranks. And though she had faced setbacks, those in King's Landing who remembered the last Targaryen in the Red Keep, Mad King Aerys, father to Daenerys, remained terrified at the thought of Targaryens returning with fire and blood. Cersei and the small council bickered endlessly on the matter of how best to deal with Daenerys. Some wanted her assassinated outright. Others insisted that the realm could not afford another war. If word of her unstoppable dragons was true, any conflict would bring devastation that made the War of the Five Kings look tame. It was in this swirl of uncertainty and intrigue that an unlikely proposition was laid upon the table. A marriage pact, forging an alliance between House Targaryen and House Lannister. A few on the council balked. How could they trust a Targaryen, especially one known as the breaker of chains, the freer of slaves? How could they possibly tie the realm's fate to dragons? Yet others argued that Daenerys's hold on Slaver's Bay was precarious. She might actually be open to a marriage alliance that would secure her the Iron Throne without fighting a war in Westeros. And House Lannister, battered though it was by the hardships of the last few years, was still the wealthiest great house, still in command of what remained of the crown's power. If Daenerys was wise, perhaps she would see sense in forging a pact, especially if that pact was delivered by one who was, in many ways, central to the Targaryen past. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer who had once slain Daenerys' father, the Mad King Aerys too, in that final, bloody moment of Robert's rebellion. Jaime returned from the Riverlands thinner and wearier than he had been at the start of the war. He had only one hand to wield a sword, and although he had trained relentlessly to regain some measure of prowess, he knew he was no longer the same shining knight who had once been considered the greatest swordsman in the realm. Physically, he was intact apart from the missing hand, but inside, a turmoil brewed. The man who had once defined himself by his skill in battle now had to reconcile the loss of that skill with a conscience that had begun to wake from its long slumber. He was present at the small council meeting when the plan was broached. Cersei, robed in Lannister red, eyes narrowed with suspicion, had proposed that if Daenerys Targaryen could be swayed to peace, then perhaps the Lannisters might save themselves from another devastating war. Tywin had once taught them all that the family legacy mattered above all else. Tommen's hold on the throne was far from secure. The Tyrells breathed down their necks with their armies and their gardens of gold, but the Tyrells were not the ancient seat of Targaryen power. If the Lannisters could bring the Dragon Queen to heel, even partially, they could effectively keep the Iron Throne in Lannister hands, whether Tommen's or otherwise. Yet who among them would marry Daenerys Targaryen? Tommen was already wed. Kevan Lannister was too old and Lancel too weak. Besides, the faith militant shadowed Lancel's every move. It had to be someone else with the name and the rank to matter. Cersei had said the words in an idle, clipped tone, as though she scarcely believed them even while they left her lips. "Jaime," she had said, her green eyes flicking to him from the head of the table. "You will go to treat with her." Jaime stared back. The notion seemed absurd. He was the Kingsguard, sworn to protect the king, sworn never to wed, never to have lands or children. But the realm had changed, and so had the nature of his oaths. The Kingsguard vow had already been tested beyond reason. He had broken parts of it, twisted parts of it, or seen them twisted by others, so many times that he could scarcely recall which portion of his vow remained sacred. He was no Barristan Selmy, nor had he ever been as honorable as the great knight once was. In his mind, he could hear the distant echo of his father's voice. "You will do your duty." And so Jaime had stood there, mouth parted, at a loss for words. If forging peace meant wedding Daenerys Targaryen, if it meant traveling across the sea to stand in front of 3 fully grown dragons, if it meant atoning, in some twisted sense, for the debt he owed her family, then perhaps it was what he had to do. He thought briefly of Tyrion, who had vanished somewhere across the sea, rumored to have traveled east. Some said to Pentos, others to Volantis, others to lands unknown. Would he see Tyrion again if he traveled to Meereen or beyond? The idea weighed on him in a way he could not fully ignore. And so it was settled, not with the fanfare of a royal decree, but with the desperation of a realm that had little choice. A small retinue was assembled, and Jaime prepared for the long voyage across the narrow sea. Cersei gave him parting words that sounded both contemptuous and oddly protective. For as much as she had grown to resent him, she still saw him as her twin, her reflection in a cracked mirror. "Be careful," she had said, her voice tinged with an old bitterness. "The dragon girl might just burn you alive." Then Jaime was gone, leaving King's Landing by ship, crossing the seas that smelled of salt and fish, heading for the east where the Targaryen queen ruled with her dragons and her freedmen and her sellswords. The journey took weeks, and in that time, he had ample moments to dwell on the history he carried with him. King Aerys, the man he had slain to save the city from wildfire, had been Daenerys' father. Would she see him as a traitor? A murderer? She likely would. Yet here he was as a suitor. The gods, in their infinite sense of irony, had twisted his life so thoroughly that he could scarcely recognize it. Meanwhile, across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen sat on the throne in Meereen, trying to keep peace between factions of freedmen and old masters. She had reopened the fighting pits under pressure, though the practice still turned her stomach. She had lost Ser Barristan Selmy in one of the attacks by the Sons of the Harpy, lost one of the best men she had known in her short life, and the pain of it still weighed upon her. She had locked Rhaegal and Viserion beneath the Great Pyramid, fearing for the lives of her people. Drogon, however, had carried her off during the grand melee in the pit, and for a time she had been lost to the desert, forced to roam amongst the Dothraki once again. Eventually, she reclaimed some measure of control. She returned to Meereen, riding in on Drogon's back, to the awe and fear of all who witnessed it. Now she was resolved to do better, though every day proved a struggle. When the Lannister ship arrived in the Bay of Dragons, once Slaver's Bay, Daenerys listened to the herald's introduction with guarded curiosity. The man who sought an audience with her was none other than Ser Jaime Lannister, Lord Commander of King Tommen's Kingsguard, or what remained of it, anyway. The first thought that crossed her mind was that this man had killed her father. Yet, to Daenerys, the Mad King was only a shadowy figure conjured by the stories of Viserys, by the recollections of others. She had never known her father as a living presence, only as a myth of madness and cruelty, or as a figure of pity who had lost everything to Robert's rebellion. The second thought that crossed her mind was that she had once been told, by Ser Barristan, how Aerys had grown wild and paranoid, how he had threatened to burn the city and everyone in it. Barristan had revealed the truth, that Jaime might have saved thousands of innocent lives by striking down the king he had sworn to protect. Daenerys, flanked by Missandei and Grey Worm, consented to grant Jaime an audience in the Great Pyramid's throne room. She wore a simple yet regal dress of pale gray, embroidered with small dragons at the cuffs, her silver-gold hair braided behind her, and across her shoulders she draped a cloak stitched with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. She looked at Jaime with curiosity, noticing how the man's golden hair was streaked now with hints of silver near the temples, how his left sleeve ended in a golden hand. He stood with the easy grace of one who had once been a paragon of knighthood, but he carried a humility in his eyes that she had not expected. Jaime knelt, and though his vow to the Kingsguard theoretically forbade such acts of obeisance to any but the king, he knew protocol demanded respect for the woman who called herself Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. He rose, and he began to speak the words he had rehearsed. Yet the moment he looked into Daenerys's eyes, his polished speech faltered. He saw in her a quiet mixture of expectation and wariness. She might have been quite young, indeed younger than him by many years, but the burdens she had carried had etched themselves into her posture. He spoke of King Tommen's desire for peace, of the realm's exhaustion from war, of the willingness to support Daenerys's claim in exchange for a bloodless transition. There would be conditions, of course. No retribution for Robert's rebellion, no immediate purges of the great houses, certain alliances that must remain unbroken, a more tolerant view of the old faiths and traditions of Westeros. Daenerys listened, occasionally flicking her eyes to Missandei, who would quietly translate or clarify. But Daenerys spoke the common tongue perfectly well enough, and she interrupted only to question Jaime about his father, about the cruelty visited upon her family, about the atrocities that had befallen her as a child, forced to flee from one land to another like a beggar. Jaime, for his part, did not try to defend the events of Robert's rebellion too fiercely. He had his own perspective. He had been a young man, forced into an impossible situation by a father who had ambitions of his own, by a king who was driven to madness, by a realm that had turned upon itself. But he did not try to excuse the suffering of Daenerys or her brother. Instead, he recounted the truth of Aerys's last hours. He explained how the Mad King had set wildfire caches throughout King's Landing, how he had commanded Jaime to bring him Tywin's head, and how, in a final delirium, Aerys had threatened to burn them all, men, women, and children, so that he could be reborn from the ashes as a dragon. Daenerys did not speak for a time, though inside she felt the swirl of emotion. She thought of Viserys, who had always extolled the rights of House Targaryen, but who had been cruel and petty. She thought of how Ser Barristan had once tried to show her the difference between good men and good kings, and how the two were not always the same. Aerys might have been her father, and he might have been wronged in many ways, but he was not innocent of tyranny. The tension in the air remained thick, and the watchers in the throne room dared not speak. At last, Daenerys asked Jaime what the Lannisters wanted from her in return for their offered fealty. Jaime did not flinch. "A marriage," he said plainly, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, "between House Lannister and House Targaryen. That is the offer I have been sent to place before you." For a long time, Daenerys said nothing. She studied Jaime, measuring him. She saw his golden hand, his bright green eyes, the fine lines that edged them. She considered the weight of his words. A marriage. She had once been sold off by her brother to Khal Drogo. She had once believed in a union with Hizdahr zo Loraq to keep peace in Meereen. She knew that, in the Game of Thrones, political unions were weapons as sharp as any sword. She asked, in a level tone, "And you, Kingslayer, are you willing to be that husband?" A flicker passed through Jaime's gaze, a mixture of regret and acceptance. "If it will save the realm from further bloodshed," he replied, "I will do what I must." Their courtship, if it could be called that, was an exercise in both diplomacy and personal reckoning. Daenerys, who had come to rely upon her own instincts and the counsel of those who followed her, found Jaime Lannister to be at times surprisingly honest. Though he did not volunteer every detail of his life, he did not try to hide the fact that he had been Cersei's lover, or that he had fathered her children. She had heard the rumors, and the truth was not so different from what rumor had conjured. But he spoke of it in a tired voice, as though it was a chapter of his life he was neither proud of nor entirely ashamed of. He spoke of the vow he broke when he slew the king, and of how the realm had spat on him for it, even though he believed he had saved countless innocents. He spoke also of his shift in perspective over the years, how once he had seen only the glory of knighthood, but now he saw the stain of hypocrisy that ran through it all. Daenerys, for her part, was forthcoming about her own trials. She told him how she had grown up in terror of her own brother, how she had survived the Red Waste with her newborn dragons, how she had liberated Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen only to find that ruling was far more difficult than conquering. She described the anguish she felt when she realized her dragons, which she loved like her own children, could kill without remorse. And she let him see that behind the title of queen and the might of dragons, she was still a woman who carried scars from betrayal, from heartbreak, from the relentless demands of responsibility. In truth, no one, not even Missandei or Grey Worm, anticipated that Daenerys would find any reason to trust the Kingslayer. But as the days became weeks, as they exchanged stories of their pasts, each of them gleaned the faintest glimmer of the other's vulnerability. Jaime recognized that Daenerys Targaryen was not her father. She was fierce, but she was not wantonly cruel. She had a sense of justice, though tempered by the difficulties of enforcing it in a world shaped by brutality and greed. She could be ruthless. She had proven that to the slavers, to those who betrayed her or harmed her people. But she was not mad. And Daenerys saw that Jaime Lannister was not simply the vain, arrogant knight who had once pushed Bran Stark from a window. That part of him had existed, yes, but he had changed. She saw a man who carried the weight of every oath he had broken, who had lost his hand, who had been humiliated, and who was trying, in his own flawed way, to do something resembling honor. Still, the notion of marriage between them was fraught with complexities. Daenerys' counselors debated furiously behind closed doors. Some pointed out that if Daenerys wed Jaime Lannister, she would tie herself to a house known for deceit and cunning. Others argued that this could be the path to reclaiming Westeros without unleashing another war that would cost thousands of lives. The presence of 3 dragons was a formidable deterrent, but Daenerys had learned the cost of using them as instruments of destruction. Bloodshed was not always the best or only answer. At length, after many negotiations, Daenerys agreed to sail to Westeros with her forces, Unsullied, Dothraki, freedmen, and dragons, and land near Dragonstone. There, a grand ceremony would be held to formalize the union between House Targaryen and House Lannister, in the very seat that had once served as the ancestral stronghold of the Targaryens. From there, they would proceed to King's Landing, where King Tommen would legitimize the marriage and name Daenerys as his heir, to succeed him on the Iron Throne or to share in its rule, depending on how events unfolded. The crossing was a spectacle unlike any in living memory. Daenerys' fleet, swollen with ships from Slaver's Bay and from sympathetic lords in the Narrow Sea, stretched across the waves. Above, Drogon, Regal, and Viserion soared, their shadows passing over the crests of the water. Jaime sailed on a Lannister vessel, but he spent much of his time either gazing over the railing at the horizon or speaking quietly with Daenerys when she allowed his presence. She would occasionally ride Drogon into the sky, scouting ahead or simply reveling in her freedom. Jaime, for all his composure, felt a quiet awe at the sight of the dragons. Once, many years ago, he had been enthralled by the stories of Targaryen knights who soared with their dragons in the Age of Conquest. Standing on the deck and seeing Drogon's wings slicing the air brought a tingle to his spine, reminding him that in truth, the dragons had returned, and the world might never be the same. When they finally made landfall at Dragonstone, Daenerys felt a shiver run through her. She had never set foot on the isle of her birth, though she had heard stories that she was born amidst the greatest storm in living memory. Now she disembarked, accompanied by Missandei and Grey Worm, by Daario Naharis, whom she had not fully cast aside, but whose position was a precarious mix of lover and subordinate, and by Tyrion Lannister, who had joined her not long ago after escaping King's Landing and forging a new path in Meereen. Tyrion and Jaime exchanged glances upon meeting, uncertain whether to embrace or stand apart. They settled on a curt nod, acknowledging a shared past they could not easily discuss. A force of Lannister bannermen and King's Landing representatives waited on shore, albeit in smaller numbers. Cersei had not accompanied them. She had chosen to remain in the capital, but she had sent several high-ranking advisors to witness the event. Varys, that master of whispers, was also present, having rejoined Daenerys' cause. The great hall of Dragonstone was prepared for a wedding, though it was a far cry from the typical lavish ceremony one might expect for such an alliance. War was always near, and the realm's coffers were drained, so the celebration was more somber than jubilant, more anxious than triumphant. In front of a small sept set up within the castle walls, Dragonstone did not have a grand sept, for the Targaryens had often kept to their own faith in dragons and Valyrian rites. The wedding took place. Daenerys wore a gown of shimmering red and black, the colors of House Targaryen. Jaime, in acknowledgement of House Lannister, was clothed in gold-trimmed crimson. Their union was blessed by a septon from King's Landing, who seemed more nervous than either of them, aware of the dragons lurking just outside, their roars occasionally vibrating the very stones of the castle. Tyrion stood by Jaime, though he could not resist a sardonic quip under his breath now and again. Missandei served as Daenerys' attendant, solemnly offering her counsel and keeping her steady when doubts threatened to surface. Daenerys recited the words with Jaime, each promising to take the other in marriage, to share in responsibilities and burdens. When it came to the exchange of tokens, Jaime offered her a ring shaped like a golden lion's head, and Daenerys slid onto his finger a band forged in the shape of a dragon devouring its own tail. It was not quite the grand romance of legends. Each had reservations so deep they could not be easily put into words, but each also recognized that they were forging a new path for themselves and for the realm. If any marriage in the history of Westeros had been overshadowed by so many tragedies and so many hopes, it was this one. The aftermath of the wedding was rife with tension. They had formed an alliance, yes, but many in Westeros balked at the idea of a Targaryen returning, let alone a Targaryen wedded to the Kingslayer. The North remembered the horrors inflicted by House Lannister, from the Red Wedding to the sacking of Winterfell by Lannister-allied forces. The South trembled at the idea of dragons scorching fields and leveling cities. In King's Landing, the reaction was mixed. Tommen, young and impressionable, seemed relieved at the possibility of peace. Cersei, it was said, was a storm behind the walls of the Red Keep, furious at the idea that her brother would marry the Dragon Queen and perhaps overshadow her own influence. Nevertheless, Daenerys and Jaime advanced upon King's Landing with a carefully prepared retinue. A large host of Unsullied marched with them, disciplined and silent. A cavalry of Dothraki screeched and hooped, eager for glory. Dragons circled overhead, their wings blotting out the sun. The Lannister forces stationed in King's Landing had been forewarned. Stand down or face annihilation. Most did indeed stand down. The city, weary of bloodshed, watched with something resembling awe and dread as the gates opened to let the procession in. Jaime rode at Daenerys' side, his metal hand resting lightly on his sword's hilt, though no blade was drawn. He glanced at the faces of the small folk lining the streets. He saw fear, curiosity, uncertainty. Gold cloaks parted to let the queen pass. The whisper of Mother of Dragons rustled through the crowd, along with the name Kingslayer. The combined effect was a hush that settled over the throngs. At the Red Keep, Tommen awaited them on the Iron Throne, flanked by Cersei, her face unreadable as she watched her brother and Daenerys approach. The formalities proceeded in a stiff, measured way. Tommen greeted Daenerys as his beloved aunt by marriage, though the genealogical ties were muddled, and offered her a seat by his side. She, in turn, spoke of forging a new era for the Seven Kingdoms. Her voice carried power in the Great Hall, the same hall where her father had once reigned in madness, and where Jaime had slain him. That was how Daenerys Targaryen, the unburnt mother of dragons, came to be recognized as the co-ruler of the Seven Kingdoms alongside Tommen Baratheon. Jaime was hailed, awkwardly, as her consort, her lord husband, though the official line was that he remained in the Kingsguard for the time being. An impossible contradiction, yet in a realm so battered by war, those kinds of contradictions were overlooked if it meant stability. Rumor had it that Cersei's mind began to spiral the moment Daenerys was recognized in King's Landing. She had been Queen Regent, one of the most powerful women in the realm, and now she watched power slip through her fingers. In the days and weeks that followed, Daenerys set herself to the task of learning the true shape of the Seven Kingdoms she had inherited. She listened to the pleas of supplicants, tried to reconcile the injustices left by the wars, and attempted to lay the groundwork for a new rule that would not be overshadowed by further bloodshed. Jaime was often at her side, part guardian, part counselor, part symbol. The small folk might whisper about the strangeness of it, the Kingslayer wed to the Dragon Queen, but their presence together was a statement of a realm forcibly healed, or at least bandaged. And in private, the two navigated the complicated waters of a marriage that had begun as a political bargain. Daenerys was not a woman easily swayed by flattery or charm, but Jaime, ironically, no longer possessed the kind of shallow charm that might have appealed to a younger girl. Instead, he had a subdued wit, a directness that Daenerys found disarming at times. He could be honest to a fault, especially about his own failings. When she asked him about the worst deed he had ever done, he told her about Bran Stark without sugarcoating it. He told her how he had pushed the boy from a tower to protect his relationship with Cersei. Daenerys listened, lips pressed together. Eventually, she asked if he would do the same now. He paused a long moment before answering, "No," in a quiet voice, laced with regret. She believed him. She did not forgive the act, but she believed he had changed. And, in turn, when he asked about her darkest moment, she told him how she had crucified hundreds of Meereenese masters in vengeance for the children they had crucified along the road. She told him of the coldness that had seized her heart, the righteous fury she had felt. Then she told him how, in retrospect, she feared it might have been too much. Justice, yes, but overshadowed by cruelty. Jaime listened without judgment, seeing the conflict in her. It occurred to him that this was the first time, aside from Brienne of Tarth, that he had truly listened to someone speak of atonement in a way that resonated with his own experiences. Their nights were often quiet. Neither rushed to consummate the marriage, for it had been sealed more by oath than desire. But eventually, the closeness of whispered secrets, the shared burdens of rule, and the peculiar sense of trust that had begun to form drew them together. It was tentative at first, each uncertain how to show intimacy to the other. Daenerys was used to leading armies, commanding dragons. Jaime had spent so many years entangled with Cersei that he scarcely knew how to be tender with another. Yet over time, a fragile understanding grew into something that, if not quite love, was at least companionship. Of course, many forces in the realm were not pleased by this new development. The High Sparrow and the Faith Militant, still reeling from their conflicts with Cersei, eyed Daenerys with suspicion. They claimed she was born of incest, a blasphemy in the eyes of the Seven. They claimed she practiced dark arts by commanding dragons. Meanwhile, lords in the Westerlands who remained loyal to the Lannisters begrudged Jaime for his half-hearted acceptance of Targaryen rule. In the north, House Stark, led now by Sansa Stark with the support of the Vale, demanded justice for the havoc the Lannisters had wreaked upon their family. They remembered Ned Stark's execution, the Red Wedding, the occupations and betrayals. The fact that Daenerys and Jaime had married did little to assuage the bitterness. Over the next season, Daenerys traveled to several parts of Westeros, trying to mend old wounds and reinforce her claim. Jaime accompanied her, wearing armor of red and black instead of the white cloak of the Kingsguard. They ventured to Highgarden, seeking an alliance with the Tyrells. They journeyed to the Riverlands, meeting with those who had survived the devastation of the war. Everywhere they went, They brought a retinue of Unsullied and a small flight of dragons overhead, just enough to remind the local lords where power now lay. At Riverrun, they found the castle recovering under the direction of Lord Edmure Tully, who had been reinstated after his captivity. Edmure greeted Daenerys with a courtesy that was tinged with resentment. Jaime, who had once besieged Riverrun, confronted the Tully lord with uneasy politeness. Yet Daenerys managed to coax a measure of cooperation from Edmure by promising relief to the war-torn region and by listening to the Tully grievances. The freedmen in her retinue offered aid to the small folk, distributing some of the supplies that had been gathered from the crown's storehouses. All the while, Daenerys and Jaime were forging an identity as a royal couple. They were not exactly beloved. Fear and war-weariness dominated the hearts of many, but they were recognized as a formidable presence. Daenerys tried to quell any further violence by displaying her dragons in controlled shows of power rather than burning entire armies. She recognized, with Tyrion's counsel, that she needed to show stability and justice above all else. Jaime supported her in this, adding his own insight into Westerosi customs and the reputations of various lords. He knew who could be trusted, who was likely to betray them, and who might remain neutral if left unthreatened. At King's Landing, Cersei grew quieter and more unpredictable by the day, rarely appearing in court. Tommen, too young to truly assert authority, spent most of his time studying under maesters or hosting small councils that were overshadowed by Daenerys' presence. Slowly, it became clear that the real power resided with the Dragon Queen, her husband Jaime, and the small council led by Tyrion, Varys, and other advisors who sought a peaceful transition. Margaery Tyrell, Tommen's queen, maintained her charm and goodwill among the people, subtly supporting Daenerys in her attempts to secure alliances, for Margaery sensed that if a Targaryen was on the throne, it might help quell the North's rebellious spirit and lead to a lasting truce. But not all discontent could be smoothed over by good intentions. House Bolton had fallen in the north, the bastard Ramsay defeated by a northern coalition and the Knights of the Vale. Yet the scars of the Red Wedding remained. House Frey still held the twins, though it was greatly diminished in power, and Walder Frey had died under suspicious circumstances. Whispers said Arya Stark had returned to exact vengeance. The armies of the North, now rallying around Winterfell and House Stark, were not content to bend the knee without proper justice for what they had suffered. There were calls for the Lannisters to pay restitution. Some demanded that Jaime be held accountable, or that the Queen publicly acknowledge the crimes committed by House Lannister in the war. Daenerys, who had set herself up as a queen of mercy and justice, felt the weight of these demands press heavily upon her. She saw how Jaime's face would grow drawn when the North's accusations were listed. She wondered whether she should force him to stand trial for his involvement in the war. But such a move would almost certainly fracture their fragile peace. She considered traveling north herself to treat with Sansa Stark, to see if some arrangement could be made. Jaime, for his part, was willing to face the North's questions, but he worried for the realm if he were found guilty and executed. It would tear the new peace asunder. Ultimately, Daenerys decided that the only way forward was to go north with her dragons and her husband, to meet with Sansa Stark and the Northern Lords in person. The journey was cold and arduous, a stark contrast to the warm, sunny roads of the south. As they traveled, snow began to fall, heralding the coming of a long, bitter winter. Daenerys arrived at Winterfell with her retinue, though she left most of her forces stationed at Moat Cailin, so as not to appear too threatening. She brought only a fraction of her Unsullied, and her dragons, which unsettled the northern populace when they soared above the ancient fortress. Sansa Stark, tall, poised, and every inch a lady of the North, received Daenerys in the Great Hall. She was flanked by lords and knights who eyed Jaime with open hostility. Yet Sansa did not lash out. She addressed Daenerys with courtesy, referring to her as Your Grace, and accepted her gifts of bread and salt. Daenerys explained that she wished for reconciliation, that she understood the North's grievances and wanted to find a way to restore faith in the crown. Jaime stood beside Daenerys, wearing no helm, his golden hair exposed, his golden hand gleaming in the torchlight. He gazed over the northern faces, remembering how he had once faced Robb Stark's army, how he had been held captive by Catelyn Stark. So much had changed, yet so many wounds remained. The meeting that followed was tense. Lords of the North recounted the atrocities House Lannister had perpetrated, from the murder of Ned Stark to the Red Wedding's betrayal by Lannister allies. Jaime responded with what honesty he could, acknowledging that the Lannisters bore responsibility, though he reminded them that Tywin Lannister, the architect of so much suffering, was dead, as were many who had participated in the worst of the crimes. He offered apologies, though he knew apologies were scarcely enough to heal such deep wounds. In the end, Daenerys offered a formal statement of regret on behalf of the Iron Throne for the sufferings inflicted on the North and pledged certain reparations, ships of grain and supplies from the Reach to ensure the North did not starve in the coming winter, rebuilding efforts funded by the Crown's coffers, and a promise that the next Warden of the North would be selected from the Stark line without contest. She also promised that any who had directly perpetrated the cruelties of the Red Wedding and were still alive would face justice, urging the Freys to stand trial in King's Landing for their crimes. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a gesture that made it possible for the Northern Lords to consider bending the knee to the new regime. Sansa, after several days of negotiations and private talks with Daenerys, agreed to reaffirm House Stark's loyalty to the Targaryen crown, albeit with the stipulation that the North maintain some autonomy in its local governance. Daenerys, mindful of the lessons she had learned in Meereen about letting local traditions and authorities stand, accepted. Once the formalities were concluded, a feast was held in Winterfell, subdued but not without some sense of relief that war, for the moment, seemed to be averted. During that feast, Jaime found himself leaning against a stone pillar at the edge of the Great Hall, cradling a cup of northern ale with his golden hand. He watched Daenerys seated beside Sansa, the two women speaking quietly, occasionally glancing his way. The hall was lit with hearth fires, their warmth battling the chill that seeped through the walls. Outside, the wind howled across the snowfields. He thought of how improbable his life had become, that he would stand here in Winterfell as the husband of a Targaryen queen, seeking the goodwill of a Stark. A part of him still felt the pang of shame for all that had transpired, for the children he had fathered in secret with Cersei, for the broken vows, for the bitter taste of regrets that no simple apology could wash away. And yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt as though he was trying to be a better man, if only because the woman he served and was wed to deserved it. Perhaps it was a fool's hope, but it was a hope nonetheless. The winter that swept over Westeros was harsh, forcing the realm into a state of near hibernation. Travel became difficult. Daenerys decided that she and Jaime would remain in Winterfell for a time, to bolster the alliances in the north and to ensure that none of the northern lords used the crown's absence to stir dissent. During those long, cold months, she and Jaime took to exploring the ancient corridors of the castle, sometimes together, sometimes separate. Daenerys spent time with the dragons, who were restless in the cold, but still soared over the godswood, scorching patches of earth to keep warm. Jaime, after some hesitation, offered to train with the younger northern warriors in the yard, demonstrating what skill he could manage with his single hand. He was no longer the swordsman of legend, but he had learned to adapt, and his cunning and technique still served him well. Some of the young men jeered at the Kingslayer behind his back, but others watched him with a sort of morbid fascination, especially when they recognized that, despite the missing hand, he could still best many of them in a duel. As the snows piled up against the walls of Winterfell, Daenerys found herself confiding in Jaime more often, telling him of her dreams. Sometimes they were visions of dragons dancing in a red sky, sometimes nightmares of betrayal and death. He listened, offering neither empty assurances nor dismissals of her fears. She asked him about what he dreamed of, and he said, "I dream of the day I can stop looking over my shoulder." She didn't press him further, but she understood. Little by little, a certain camaraderie and tenderness grew between them. At night, nestled beneath thick furs to guard against the biting cold, they would speak of the future. Daenerys confided that she was not sure she could have children. She recalled the curse Mirri Maz Duur had spoken of, the uncertainty surrounding her fertility. Jaime, who had fathered children with Cersei, did not push the issue, though he admitted that it might complicate the succession question if Daenerys could not produce an heir. Nevertheless, they did not let that weigh too heavily on their bond. Their union had begun for the sake of the realm, but it had grown into something that might be a fragile semblance of genuine partnership. When spring finally began to edge away the snows, Daenerys and Jaime prepared to return south, both to tend to matters in King's Landing and to keep an eye on the shifting alliances in the realm. As they left Winterfell, they parted from Sansa and the Northern Lords on better terms than they had arrived, though the North's trust remained guarded. Still, the immediate threat of open rebellion had been pacified. Their travels took them first to the Vale of Arryn, where young Lord Robert Arryn ruled under the guidance of Petyr Baelish, known as Littlefinger. Daenerys had heard many a rumor about Baelish's cunning. She approached the Vale with caution, aware that the man's ambitions might extend toward controlling the Iron Throne. Yet the Vale had not yet been ravaged by war as thoroughly as other regions, and they had resources the crown sorely needed. Jaime advised caution but also recognized the value of the Vale's knights, which had proven decisive in some battles. The negotiations with Lord Robert Arryn proved smoother than expected, largely because the boy was easily swayed by flattery and gifts. Baelish, for his part, studied Daenerys and Jaime with watchful eyes, making polite conversation about how the realm was changing. Daenerys found herself unsettled by his half-smiles and quicksilver words, but she remained poised, refusing to betray any doubt. Jaime, who had spent years at court, recognized a fellow manipulator in Baelish. He quietly warned Daenerys that Littlefinger would turn on them the moment it served his own interests. She nodded, having come to similar conclusions. For now, they secured a pledge of fealty from the Vale in exchange for certain positions at court. Littlefinger wanted to be recognized as Lord Paramount of the Trident, or as the steward of some new enterprise. Daenerys gave him enough to satisfy his ambitions without granting him too much power, hoping that it would keep him in line, at least temporarily. After the Vale, they traveled to the Trident to Harrenhal to oversee the partial rebuilding of that cursed fortress. Smoke still drifted from its shattered towers, where Dragonfire centuries ago had melted its stone. Daenerys gazed upon the blackened ruin, recalling how Aegon the Conqueror had dealt with Harren the Black. Jaime watched her in profile, wondering if she felt pride or unease at the power her ancestors had wielded. Perhaps both. Here, the dragons soared overhead, and their roars echoed in the warped halls, as if to remind the present of the unstoppable might of the past. As they approached the capital once again, ravens arrived with troubling reports. King Tommen had fallen ill, some mysterious sickness that left him bedridden. Cersei was in a rage, shutting herself in her chambers, refusing to see the maesters. Margaery Tyrell was urging calm, but tensions in the city were rising. Daenerys quickened her pace, summoning her dragons to fly ahead in case chaos had broken out. They arrived at the Red Keep to find the royal court in turmoil. Tommen was pale, feverish, breathing in shallow gasps. The maester suspected poison, but no one could prove it. Rumors abounded. Some blamed the Tyrells, others blamed an agent from Dorne seeking vengeance for Oberyn Martell's death. Still others whispered that perhaps Cersei herself had orchestrated the poisoning as part of some twisted ploy. No evidence was conclusive. Daenerys moved quickly to stabilize the situation. She summoned the Grand Maester, demanded every remedy be tried. Jaime, distraught at the sight of his son, even if he could never publicly call him that, sat by Tommen's bedside, his golden hand trembling against the boy's. Tommen, disoriented, did not recognize him at times, calling instead for Ser Pounce, his cat, or for Margaery. Cersei was nowhere to be seen, having locked herself away behind a barricade of her personal guards. In the following days, Daenerys attempted to hold court, to show that the throne was not vacant even with Tommen incapacitated. She stood in the Great Hall with Jaime at her side, addressing the many pleas and concerns of lords and emissaries who poured into King's Landing. The tension was palpable. If Tommen died, who would inherit the throne? Daenerys was, by many accounts, next in line, if not the rightful occupant of it already. But others might still contest that. Would Margaery Tyrell claim it through marriage? Or would the faith militant declare her unfit? Would the realm accept Daenerys wholeheartedly, or would fresh rebellions surge up, claiming that the Targaryen line had been extinguished by Robert's rebellion and that she was a usurper? Jaime watched Daenerys handle the court with a steady hand, balancing promises of continued stability with reminders that the crown had dragons and would not tolerate further treachery. Part of him marveled at how naturally she took to the role, as though she had been born to it. Another part of him wondered how far she would go if truly tested. Would she become like her father, unleashing dragonfire upon her foes? Or would she find a better way? He hoped his presence, along with Tyrion's counsel, might guide her away from madness should she ever be pushed too far. Tommen's condition deteriorated. Late one night, as Jaime kept vigil, the boy gave a final weak sigh and passed from this world. Jaime stood there in numb horror. He had lost Joffrey in a vile poisoning, had lost Myrcella in Dorne to another vile plot, and now Tommen was gone. All his children with Cersei, all three of them, dead before they reached adulthood. He bowed his head, feeling as though the gods were punishing him for his sins, for the illicit nature of their births. Yet Tommen had been the gentlest, the most innocent, and Jaime could hardly bear the reality that the boy was gone. When news spread that Tommen had died, the city erupted into chaos. Some shouted for Margaery to be crowned as Queen Dowager, others for Daenerys to claim the throne outright. The Tyrells, outraged by the loss of their second royal match in so short a time, massed troops around the city, though they did not yet attack. The faith militants saw this as a sign of the gods' wrath, redoubling their hold on the masses. Riots broke out in Flea Bottom, spurred by rumors that the Targaryen queen had somehow arranged Tommen's demise to seize power. In the Red Keep, Daenerys faced a choice. The throne was now vacant, for all intents and purposes. She could be crowned. She had the marriage alliance and the bloodline claim. Most of the small council, including Tyrion, urged her to move swiftly to secure her legitimacy. Jaime, however, was paralyzed with grief and guilt. He had lost his son. He could not even publicly mourn as a father, forced instead to act the role of a concerned uncle. Daenerys offered him what comfort she could, but she also needed to make decisions for the realm. She recognized that in times of crisis, swift action could prevent further bloodshed. Thus, Daenerys was crowned in the Red Keep, in a ceremony more solemn than celebratory. She donned the crown of the Targaryen kings, the circlet shaped like a dragon's wings, and seated herself on the Iron Throne. The court knelt, though not all did so willingly. She proclaimed that she would rule with justice and mercy, that she would honor Tommen's memory by striving for the peace he had wanted. She did not hide the fact that she had dragons at her command, an unspoken warning to any who might challenge her. Margaery Tyrell, veiled and mourning, said little, but there was no explicit move of rebellion by the Tyrells, at least not yet. Jaime stood by Daenerys' side as her husband and protector. Some called him king consort, though it was never formally recognized in the same manner as if he had been a husband to a queen by birth alone. Yet he was there, silent and brooding. The realm took note. The Kingslayer now served a new queen on the Iron Throne. The days following Daenerys' coronation were tumultuous. She sent out ravens to all corners of the realm, declaring her rule, offering amnesty to any lords who would bend the knee, and threatening swift retribution to those who resisted. The Tyrells were placated, for the moment, by her offer of continued alliance and influence in court. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock recognized her, if grudgingly, since Jaime was her consort. The North, with Sansa Stark at its head, offered conditional fealty, reaffirming the terms Daenerys and Sansa had agreed upon in Winterfell. The Vale's stance was uncertain, but Littlefinger seemed content to bide his time, perhaps waiting for an opportunity to seize advantage. All this Daenerys navigated with the help of Tyrion, Varys, and a handful of other counselors. Jaime, initially reeling from Tommen's death, gradually found a measure of purpose again in aiding Daenerys' cause. He recognized that she needed someone who understood the complexities of the nobility, someone who could negotiate behind closed doors with lords who still distrusted the Targaryen name. So he forced himself to attend councils, to speak on her behalf, to make appearances in the city as her consort. He had never pictured himself as a courtly figure, pressing flesh and exchanging pleasantries, but necessity forced him into the role. He found that Daenerys valued his contributions. She might not have grown up in Westeros, but she was no fool. She listened when he advised caution with certain lords, especially those with old grudges against House Targaryen. She took note of his assessment of troop movements and the condition of the royal coffers. He noticed that she was not afraid to ask for help. Her confidence was not born of arrogance alone, but of a willingness to gather knowledge. And while she could be decisive and fierce when needed, she also understood that forging a lasting dynasty would require more than dragonfire. In time, it became clear that the realm was slowly settling beneath Daenerys' rule. The small folk, weary of war, grudgingly accepted the new queen. The lords, faced with dragons and a powerful alliance network, bent the knee for fear of what might happen if they did not. Daenerys' marriage to Jaime served as a potent symbol, for better or worse. Some whispered that the Targaryen queen had tamed the Kingslayer as she had tamed her dragons. Others whispered that the Kingslayer was a traitor to his own blood, having accepted the murder of his children's father, Robert Baratheon, and then fathering children with Cersei, and now wedding Daenerys. Rumor, as always, swirled with half-truths and outright lies. Inside the Red Keep, Daenerys and Jaime developed a quiet understanding of each other's grief. He grieved for Tommen, Myrcella, and Joffrey in his own stoic way, rarely speaking of them in public. She, in turn, grieved for all that she had lost: Khal Drogo, her unborn son Rhaego, the friends and advisors who had died in Essos. Their nights sometimes ended with them lying awake, staring at the carved stone ceiling, feeling the chill that lingered even in the warm climate of the south. On occasion, Daenerys would rise and go to the balcony overlooking the city, scanning the dark sky for the shapes of her dragons. Jaime would join her, resting his golden hand on the parapet, watching the candlelit windows of the city spread out below, each light representing a life over which she now reigned. The burdens of rule were great. Daenerys saw that effectively administering the realm required far-reaching reforms. She needed to standardize the laws, restore the farmland ravaged by war, support the faith and the infrastructure that had collapsed in so many areas. She needed to handle the faith militants' resurgence carefully. She had no desire to see them grow too powerful, for her father's reign had shown how dangerous a fanatical faith could be when pitted against or allied with the crown. She recognized the practicality of forging alliances through royal pardons and marriages among her loyal followers. Amid these pressures, the marriage of Daenerys Targaryen and Jaime Lannister continued to evolve. They were no longer strangers bound by a political pact, but neither were they a couple who had grown up together in the idols of youth. Their relationship was forged in the fires of necessity, shaped by shared trauma and the realization that, in a realm as treacherous as Westeros, the only real safety might come from trusting one another. Jaime found moments of genuine fondness blossoming when he saw Daenerys laugh at Tyrion's sardonic humor, or when she insisted on visiting an orphanage in Flea Bottom, speaking to the children in a gentle tone that recalled her own days of hardship. He sensed that she carried a deep empathy within her, one that she struggled to balance against the ruthlessness demanded of a conqueror. For her part, Daenerys found herself admiring Jaime's willingness to unlearn the arrogance that had once defined him. He did not revel in his titles or his station. She saw that his missing hand had become a constant reminder of his vulnerability and the cost of his old life. She respected that he tried to atone in small ways, even if the realm might never truly forgive him. As the months bled into years, the realm slowly rebuilt itself. Peace might have been tenuous, but it was peace nonetheless. The North remained largely autonomous under House Stark. The Vale hovered under Littlefinger's watchful guidance. The Riverlands rebuilt from the devastation of the war. The Reach prospered under Tyrell's stewardship, though Lady Olenna had passed, leaving Marjorie in a delicate position. Dorne nursed old grudges, yet remained distant, focusing inward. Cersei, quietly furious in the Red Keep, rarely showed herself at court, and rumors flew that she was descending into madness or plotting a grand revenge. Through it all, Daenerys ruled as queen, crowned by the blood of dragons and propped up by an alliance with House Lannister. Jaime stood with her, a golden lion at the side of a silver dragon, forging an unlikely legend. In time, the bards began to weave songs about their marriage, a curious mix of half-fact and half-fiction, painting Daenerys as a bewitching queen and Jaime as the repentant knight who slew her father but knelt to her rule. The truth was far more complicated, filled with doubts and second thoughts, arguments and reconciliations, occasional tenderness, and the unyielding pressure of the Iron Throne. Looking upon the realm they had worked to piece back together, neither Daenerys nor Jaime could claim to know if it had been worth all the sacrifice. The ghosts of those lost, Ned Stark, Khal Drogo, Catelyn Stark, Tywin Lannister, Ser Barristan Selmy, Shireen Baratheon, Tommen, and countless more, drifted through their thoughts. Yet they moved forward, carrying the weight of history on their shoulders. Their union had brought dragons back to King's Landing in triumph instead of ruin, but the memory of fire and blood still smoldered beneath the city's foundations. In quiet moments, when Daenerys sat at the edge of the Red Keep's battlements, gazing out at Blackwater Bay, Jaime would come to stand beside her. The wind would tug at her silver-gold hair, and she would rest a hand on his golden fingers. Perhaps they would speak of small matters, the progress of rebuilding the docks, or the new seeds that the Reach had agreed to provide for the Crownland's farmland. Or perhaps they would remain silent, each lost in thought, uncertain whether the path they had chosen would lead to greatness or disaster. And yet they stood together, dragon and lion, forging ahead in a realm that desperately needed stability. Sometimes, Daenerys dreamed of a child, one with silver hair and green eyes, but upon waking, she could not recall the details. Sometimes, Jaime dreamed he was back at the moment when he stood over Aerys Targaryen with a bloody sword. Only this time, Daenerys was watching him with solemn eyes. The dream never ended the same way. In one version, he knelt and offered her the sword. In another, she turned away, leaving him in darkness. Dreams were fickle. Reality was relentless. Still, they persisted. That was the only way to survive in a land where betrayal could spring from the shadows in an instant, and the Game of Thrones devoured those who played it carelessly. Together, they walked the corridors of the Red Keep, passing tapestries that depicted Targaryen kings on their dragons, passing windows that overlooked the city that had once belonged to Aegon the Conqueror. Each new step was a reminder of the legacy they carried. He, the man who had killed a Targaryen king, now wed to a Targaryen queen. She, the exiled princess who had returned in fire to claim her birthright, forging an alliance with the house that had once betrayed her family. If there was a moral to their story, it might have been that even the most bitter enemies could find a fragile peace through necessity, and that sometimes, in the forging of that peace, something resembling love could sprout in the ashes of hatred. Whether it would endure the storms that still loomed on the horizon was another question entirely. After all, winter would come again, and war might flare anew. The White Walkers, the legends of old, might even stir beyond the wall, if the old stories held any truth. But for now, in this moment, Daenerys Targaryen, the unburnt mother of dragons, breaker of chains, and queen of the Seven Kingdoms, sat upon the Iron Throne with Jaime Lannister by her side, and the realm drew breath in relative peace. Often in the silent hush of late evening, Daenerys would walk among her dragons, feeling their hot breath on her skin, their scale-covered bodies rippling with power. Jaime would watch from a distance, sometimes venturing closer. He had learned to keep still around the dragons, to respect their moods. When Drogon allowed Jaime to approach, it was a gesture of acceptance that still amazed the knights standing guard. The Kingslayer, one-handed, battered by war, brother to the infamous Cersei, and husband to the Queen of Dragons, placed a golden palm against the black scales of Drogon's flank. In that moment, a hush fell, as if all the city below held its breath. The dragon's molten eyes flicked to Jaime, then away, uninterested. Daenerys would smile softly at the sight. An unexpected bond formed between a dragon and a man who once destroyed her father. If that was possible, perhaps anything was possible. Perhaps the realm might truly heal from its wounds. Perhaps the cycle of vengeance and betrayal could be broken, if only for a time. And though the responsibilities of rule would press upon them every waking hour, forcing them to make difficult choices and face the cunning plots of those who resented their power, They bore it side by side, a queen and her sworn knight, a Targaryen and a Lannister, forging a future from the shattered remains of the past. In the end, that was all any ruler could hope to do in Westeros. Endure, adapt, and persevere, guided by the flicker of hope that one day the realm would know true peace. And if Daenerys Targaryen's marriage to Jaime Lannister was born of necessity rather than romance, necessity had a way of cultivating surprising loyalties and unexpected affections. As the bards would later sing, theirs was the marriage that set the course of a new era. Neither purely a happily ever after nor a tragedy, but an intricate tapestry of sorrow and triumph, woven with threads of dragon scale and lion's gold. In the weeks following Daenerys Targaryen's coronation, the city of King's Landing settled into a fragile rhythm of daily life. Bakers continued to bake, blacksmiths hammered iron, and street vendors hawked their wares beneath an uneasy hush. The memory of Tommen's death was still fresh, and the rumor mills churned with new allegations each day. Marjorie Tyrell, cloaked in mourning attire, drifted through court gatherings with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. The gold cloaks maintained order in the winding streets, though their discipline was tested whenever a new wave of gossip ignited petty riots in Flea Bottom or the bustling district around the Fishmonger Square. Within the Red Keep, Daenerys Targaryen and Jaime Lannister struggled to define their rule, balancing unwavering resolve with the necessity of mercy. Tyrion Lannister, serving as Hand of the Queen, devoted himself to the labyrinth of statecraft, replying to ravens, meeting lords, soothing foreign envoys, and mediating petty feuds that threatened to escalate into larger conflicts. All the while, 3 dragons occasionally circled above the city in slow, sweeping arcs, a reminder to any would-be rebel that the crown was no longer toothless. Yet for all the outward calm, shadows lurked in half-lit corridors and behind closed doors. Varys's whispers hinted that Cersei Lannister, secluded in her chambers, was not merely grieving her last child, but plotting something that might break this tenuous peace. On some evenings, the Queen Dowager would appear for a brief dinner with the court, silent except for the occasional barbed remark. She seemed thinner, her green eyes burning with an intensity that reminded some of the Mad King's rumored mania. If her mind had begun to unravel, she concealed it behind a frosty veneer of composure. Jaime noticed every shift in Cersei's demeanor with growing disquiet. Though their bond had become tangled and threadbare, she remained his twin, woven into every memory of his childhood. Each time they crossed paths, he tried to speak some gentle greeting, but she would brush him aside. Her silence chilled him more than her scorn. Daenerys, perceptive as ever, watched from a distance but did not interfere. She knew better than to underestimate Cersei's cunning. The tension between them crackled like a brazier's embers, waiting for the slightest breath to spark a blaze. Beyond the capital, the realm balanced precariously between wariness and compliance. In the north, Sansa Stark maintained a cautious alliance with Daenerys, honoring their agreement for local autonomy while keeping a watchful eye on House Lannister. The Vale remained under Petyr Baelish's subtle influence, though rumors suggested growing unrest among the lesser lords who feared Littlefinger's ambitions. The Iron Islands had begun raiding smaller coastal villages again, testing the mettle of the new regime. Dorne seethed with old grievances, yet it remained quiet for the moment, led by House Martell's distant cousins after the bloody chaos that had befallen the region. Despite all that, Daenerys persevered. Each morning, she held court, sometimes with Jaime at her side and sometimes alone, taking the measure of petitioners who came to the throne room. She listened to the pleas of fishermen who wanted relief from ironborn raids, farmers who requested tax exemptions until they could recover from the war's ravages, and lords who jockeyed for positions within her administration. Tyrion was often close by, quietly feeding her the history and context she needed. Missandei kept meticulous records, while Grey Worm stood at attention, a silent sentinel reminding all of the Unsullied's unwavering discipline. Jaime contributed in his own way, less a traditional king consort and more a blend of royal advisor, champion, and seasoned negotiator. He received visiting knights and lords from the Westerlands, who eyed him with uncertainty, unsure if they still recognized the golden son of Tywin Lannister. When disputes required a firm hand but a gentle edge, Jaime sometimes volunteered to ride out under the crown's banner to resolve them. Despite losing his famed sword hand, he had refined his technique to be both competent in single combat and, more importantly, adept at the dance of courtesy that could defuse conflicts before blood was spilled. In one such instance, Lord Brax of Hornvale quarreled with a minor vassal over grazing rights near the border with the Riverlands. Rather than dispatch a heavy-handed host, Daenerys sent Jaime, accompanied by a small contingent of Unsullied and a Lannister banner under the new royal standard, a black and red field with the three-headed dragon and the gold lion rampant side by side. When Jaime arrived, he found the region on the brink of armed confrontation. Tensions ran high, stoked by old war grudges and the abrupt shift in the power structure after Tommen's death. Rather than threatening them with dragons, Jaime rode calmly into Lord Brax's courtyard, introduced himself as the Queen's consort, and proposed a thorough hearing of the matter. He spent 3 days listening to testimony, examining boundary stones, and cross-referencing old charters. Finally, he managed to broker a compromise involving a fair division of land use. The resolution might have been mundane, but it signaled something important. Daenerys' reign did not rely solely on fear or dragonfire. At day's end, Jaime sent a raven back to the capital detailing the peace he had negotiated, and Daenerys took note, feeling a small measure of pride in the man she had once viewed solely through the prism of her father's killer. Change, it seemed, was possible, yet even the best intentions can unravel. Winter still clutched the land in its icy grip, slower to recede than anticipated. Supplies ran low in various regions, and though Daenerys had tried to coordinate shipments from the more fertile parts of the Reach, distribution was never perfect. Hungry bellies bred desperation. Moreover, the Faith militants sensed that the capital's official stance was to keep them at arm's length. Having tasted power under the High Sparrow, they refused to fade back into obscurity. Their new leader, a stern-faced zealot named Septimeri, roused the commoners with sermons that painted dragons as abominations in the eyes of the Seven, calling for purification of the realm from unnatural forces and incestuous lines. Street preachers began to incite small riots against Targaryen rule, though none dared assault the Unsullied outright. Daenerys weighed the risk of stamping out such dissent with violent measures. She remembered how in Meereen, attempts at ruthless suppression often fanned the flames of rebellion rather than extinguishing them. Instead, she sought a more measured response. Tyrion recommended that they allow the Faith to speak, so long as they did not openly call for the overthrow of the crown. Freedom of worship, after all, could be a token of goodwill. But if they went too far, then the crown would act. Daenerys agreed, though she privately worried that giving the Faith militant an inch might invite them to take a league. Amid these domestic concerns, ravens from the wall brought more unsettling news. Wildlings were fleeing south again, claiming strange happenings beyond the far forests and frosty wastes. Sparse reports mentioned sightings of undead creatures, rumored to be White Walkers, though many in King's Landing dismissed such tales as northern superstition. Still, Sansa Stark did not dismiss them. She sent letters to Daenerys, urging her to send aid north to investigate. She stressed that the Night's Watch was severely diminished, its numbers never having recovered from the War of the Five Kings. If the wild rumors were true, the realm might face an unimaginable threat. Daenerys weighed these letters carefully. She had her hands full trying to keep the kingdom from fracturing under the current regime change. Allocating resources to the north to chase what some insisted were mere legends might weaken her fragile hold on power. Tyrion, typically pragmatic, pointed out that if the rumors proved true, ignoring them could be catastrophic. Jaime quietly added that he owed the realm a debt. If danger threatened from beyond the wall, it was their duty to investigate at the very least. But Cersei, in an uncharacteristically public moment, dismissed the letters outright during a supper in the Queen's private dining hall. She sneered over her wine goblet, her voice tight with disdain. "White Walkers? Army of the dead? Such tales are fit for frightening children and old women in the north. I see no reason to squander men and gold on a fool's errand. Let Sansa Stark handle her ghosts if she's so inclined." Then she added, cutting a glance at Daenerys, "You should focus on threats within these walls, Your Grace." Daenerys felt the barb. Yet she steadied herself, reminding everyone present of her duty as queen to protect the entirety of the Seven Kingdoms. She did not rebuke Cersei with anger. She had learned that direct provocation often backfired. Instead, she simply stated that she would give the matter serious consideration. Cersei, eyes glittering with barely contained spite, rose from the table without finishing her meal, sweeping out of the room in a swirl of Lannister crimson. That night, Daenerys sought Jaime's counsel in her solar, a modest chamber warmed by a single hearth. Tyrion was present, as were Varys and Missandei. The air was heavy with the tension that always arrived when discussing the realm's next steps. Daenerys paced near the window, where a biting wind whistled through tiny gaps in the stone. "We cannot ignore the wall," she declared, her voice firm but subdued. "Even if there is a chance these tales are true, we must investigate." Tyrion sipped from a goblet of watered wine. "You know I agree, but we must tread carefully. If we divert soldiers north and the White Walkers are nothing more than tall tales, we'll be seen as wasting valuable resources. Already, there are those in the city who call you a usurper who should remain in Essos. We must maintain a strong presence here, or any number of opportunists might seize their moment. Littlefinger, the Faith Militant, or even fractious lords from the Westerlands." Jaime, standing with his golden hand resting on the back of a chair, added softly, "If I may suggest, Your Grace, we could send a small contingent to the north, not a full army. A scouting force. If they confirm the threat is real, we'll have warning before it reaches us. If it's a fable, we lose little." Varys, hands folded within the sleeves of his robe, nodded. "Prudent. A modest force of skilled fighters, perhaps escorted by a dragon or two, would demonstrate we take the matter seriously. It would also impress upon the northern lords that the Queen does not dismiss them. Goodwill with the North is worth nurturing." Daenerys stopped pacing. She reflected on her dragons, how taking all three to the north in the dead of winter could be disastrous if they were grounded by storms. "I'll send Regal and Viserion," she decided. "Drogon is the largest, the fiercest, and the most difficult to control. I'll keep him here to guard the capital. But I will not send the dragons alone. They need their mother. I will go myself." Tyrion's eyebrows rose. "Your Grace, is that wise?" Jaime frowned. "If you leave the capital, you risk leaving it vulnerable to intrigue. I will not hide in this castle if a threat looms that could destroy the entire realm," Daenerys replied. "What kind of queen would I be then? If the rumors are mere fantasy, I shall return swiftly. If they are real, I must see the threat with my own eyes." There was a hush as the others exchanged uneasy glances. At length, Tyrion said, "Then at least take a significant guard. We can keep some Unsullied with you, and perhaps some of the Dothraki. If the roads are treacherous, you'll need strong swords." Daenerys nodded. "Yes, and I would like you to remain here, Tyrion, to oversee matters in my absence. You, Varys, and Missandei can maintain the daily functions of the court. Grey Worm will accompany me. I'll need my most trusted commander. As for you," her eyes flicked to Jaime, "I'd have you come north as well. You know the terrain better than I do. You know how to negotiate with the lords. And I trust you by my side." Jaime's mouth formed a subtle line. He felt the pull of duty. Daenerys was right that, as her consort and a Lannister with some knowledge of how northern lords thought, he could be an asset. Yet a part of him worried about leaving King's Landing with Cersei. He knew her well enough to suspect she might use the Queen's absence to attempt something drastic. Still, his place was with Daenerys. Finally, he bowed his head, his voice low and resolute. "I will go with you." Preparations proceeded at a brisk pace. Word spread quickly through the Red Keep. The Queen intended to ride north to see for herself what the Night's Watch and Sansa Stark were so troubled about. Some courtiers murmured that the Queen was chasing children's stories. Others took heart, believing it showed true leadership, that she would not shirk dangerous possibilities. Cersei, unsurprisingly, made no secret of her disapproval. She spoke openly in the corridors about the folly of abandoning the largest city in the realm to chase snow wraiths. Daenerys did not respond directly to the provocation, but ordered her own guards to keep a close eye on Cersei's movements, just in case. On the day of departure, a chill wind blew across the Blackwater Bay. The sun glinted off the gilded rooftops of the city. A column of Unsullied, a smaller band of Dothraki, and several wagons of provisions assembled in the courtyard of the Red Keep. Rhaegal and Viserion perched on the battlements, hissing restlessly, their eyes reflecting the sunlight like molten gems. Daenerys stood at the head of the column, clad in a fur-lined cloak of dark gray, her silver-gold hair braided back. At her side, Jaime wore a cloak of thick black wool over his leathers, a golden hand protruding from the end of his left sleeve. As they prepared to mount their horses, Daenerys's gaze flicked to the balconies above, where courtiers and royal staff watched. Cersei stood among them, flanked by two silent handmaidens. Her expression was inscrutable, cold, remote. Daenerys inclined her head in a polite nod, though she doubted Cersei would offer any response. Surprisingly, Jaime thought he saw a momentary flicker in Cersei's eyes, as though she felt something akin to sorrow or regret. But it vanished too quickly to be certain, replaced by the same calculating chill that had settled over her for months. Daenerys and Jaime led the procession out of the city, greeted by onlookers who lined the streets. Some cheered the queen, others simply stared. The presence of two dragons swooping overhead caused a stir, half awe and half alarm. Mothers clutched their children close. Men craned their necks to watch the beasts pass. Once they reached the open road, the journey north began in earnest. The air grew colder with each league. The crownlands gave way to the riverlands, where the rivers had partially frozen and the fields bore a crust of white snow. Villages showed signs of wear from the war and the prolonged winter, with battered hovels and hungry faces. Daenerys stopped more than once to speak with villagers, distributing what rations she could spare. Though her priority was to keep moving, she could not ignore the plight of the people. Jaime watched as she knelt to speak with ragged children, promising that the crown would see them through the winter. He recalled the extravagance that once defined kings landing under Joffrey's rule. How many times had the small folk starved while gold-laced feasts were served in the Red Keep? He said little but found a measure of respect building in him. At Harrenhal, they sheltered within the scorched walls for one night. The caretaker, a stooped old man named Gendry Farman, no relation to the blacksmith Gendry, offered them meager hospitality. Harrenhal remained a testament to the destructive power of dragons. Rhaegal and Viserion, unsettled by the ancient echoes that clung to the burned towers, roamed the skies restlessly until night fell. Daenerys gazed at the fused stone ramparts by torchlight, recalling tales of Aegon the Conqueror. She wondered if the realm still feared a repeat of that fiery devastation, no matter how much she claimed to want peace. Jaime, standing near her by a crumbling archway, murmured that Harrenhal had always been a cursed place. She nodded in silent agreement, thinking of how curses often sprang from the living, shaped by cruelty and ambition, rather than from some supernatural vendetta. They pushed on, crossing the Trident, where the cold wind whipped flurries of snow across the broad, half-frozen river. The roads grew harder, the nights longer. Winter's grip was tightening. Scouts rode ahead, and the Queen's retinue fell into an organized pattern. Unsullied in the vanguard, flanking the baggage train, with Dothraki outriders to chase off stray brigands. The presence of dragons overhead deterred most would-be marauders, though a desperate group of outlaws attempted to raid one of the rear wagons. They were swiftly driven off, and Grey Worm ordered them spared if they threw down their weapons. When they did, Daenerys had them escorted away to the nearest town with a stern warning never to test her mercy again. Eventually, they reached Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress guarding the entrance to the north. The battered stone towers loomed over a swampy terrain, partially frozen. Sentries bearing House Stark's direwolf sigil hailed them. Once the Queen's identity was established, the portcullis creaked open to let them pass. Sansa Stark was not there to greet them, having remained in Winterfell, but she had sent a small delegation to escort the royal party the rest of the way. As the group continued northward, snow blanketed the land in shifting drifts, and the temperature plummeted to a bitter chill. Jaime pulled his cloak tighter, recalling the last time he had traveled this far north, when he had been Robb Stark's prisoner. That journey had been humiliating and fraught with danger. Now, he came as a consort to the queen, but the memory of captivity still cast a shadow over his thoughts. Finally, they saw the ancient battlements of Winterfell rising from the white plains like a gray fortress carved out of ice and stone. Smoke curled from its chimneys, a welcome sign of warmth and habitation. Beyond the walls, the northern winter stretched for leagues in all directions, a realm of ice and wind. Daenerys urged her horse forward, anxious to speak with Sansa Stark and discover if these dire rumors had any substance. Rhaegal and Viserion swooped overhead, their shrieks echoing across the open sky. At the gates, the Queen and Jaime were greeted by Sansa and a host of northern lords. Sansa wore thick furs in the style of the north, her red hair pinned back in a modest arrangement. Her face remained impassive, though she dipped into a curtsy when Daenerys dismounted. Behind her, Arya Stark stood quietly, wearing leathers and carrying a dagger at her side. Her gray eyes flicked between Daenerys and Jaime with intense curiosity. The presence of Arya was unexpected. Daenerys had only heard scattered rumors about the youngest Stark daughter. Sansa spoke in a measured tone. "Your Grace, welcome to Winterfell. We are honored you have come to see for yourself." Her gaze slid to Jaime. "Sir Jaime, it's been quite some time since you were last here." Jaime inclined his head respectfully. He could sense the swirl of complex emotions behind her calm exterior. Resentment, perhaps, for past betrayals, but also a willingness to set aside old grudges if it meant survival. "Lady Stark," he replied, using the title for politeness, even though she might call herself the Lady of Winterfell or simply the rightful Warden of the North. "Yes, it has been. I thank you for receiving us." Sansa ushered them inside. Arya lingered behind for a moment, scrutinizing Jaime as though she could peel back his skin with a glance. Finally, she followed, silent as a shadow. The great hall of Winterfell had been prepared for the royal guests. Hearths blazed, tapestries depicting direwolves hung alongside the standards of the Targaryen dragon, an obvious attempt to show unity, however tentative. The atmosphere was cool rather than welcoming, an undercurrent of tension sizzling beneath the formalities. Northern men cast cautious looks at the Unsullied and at the Dothraki who were ushered to temporary lodgings. The dragons landed beyond the walls, where Ey could nest in the courtyard, though the deep snow made them restless. Once settled in the Lord Solar, Sansa wasted little time in pleasantries. She fixed her gaze on Daenerys and Jaime, then explained the situation. "Over the last several moons, more and more wildlings have crossed the wall. They bring stories of the dead walking, of white walkers leading an army that grows with each village they slaughter. We've heard rumors that Eastwatch by the Sea was attacked, though we have no solid confirmation. Communication with the Night's Watch has been sporadic." Daenerys listened, expression grave. "Have any of these creatures been sighted near the Gift or the areas south of the wall?" Sansa shook her head. "Not yet, but we can't be certain. The wall is vast, and the Night's Watch is fewer than 1,000 men. What we do know is that the wildlings are terrified, and wildlings aren't easily cowed by mere stories. We must be prepared." Jaime leaned forward, forearms resting on the table. "What of Winterfell's defenses?" "The walls are strong, but not strong enough for an army of the dead," Sansa replied. "We've begun stockpiling dragonglass weapons. Some shipments arrived from Dragonstone, courtesy of loyal bannermen who heard of Samwell Tarly's discovery. But we need more time, more resources." Daenerys nodded. She recalled the caches of dragonglass on Dragonstone, rumored to be lethal to White Walkers. "We can bring more from Dragonstone by ship, or from the stores I had Tyrion arrange before I left. As for an army, we have the Unsullied and the Dothraki. My dragons, too, will serve as weapons, if these White Walkers are truly mortal enough to be slain by fire." A faint grimace crossed Sansa's features. "We hope they can be killed at all. The old tales say dragonfire and dragonglass might work, but no one's alive who has battled them." Arya spoke then, her voice soft but firm. "If they are not killed by either, it won't matter what else we have." She locked eyes with Daenerys. "We'll need every sword and every advantage." Daenerys studied Arya's face. The young woman seemed more soldier than lady, with a quiet intensity that hinted at hidden talents. The queen recalled rumors that Arya had once traveled the free cities, training in strange arts. But gossip was often unreliable. Either way, Arya Stark radiated a self-assured confidence that Daenerys respected. Winterfell's inhabitants found themselves jolted by the sight of dragons perched outside the walls, steam curling from their nostrils in the frigid air. When night fell, Daenerys insisted on surveying the courtyard with Jaime. They walked side by side, breath-forming clouds in the cold. The dragons rumbled restlessly. Jaime touched Rhaegal's flank, his golden hand glinting in the torchlight. The dragon gave a low growl, but did not snap at him. Viserion's pale scales reflected the moonlight like shards of pearl. Snow drifted onto their spines, melting against the residual heat of their bodies. Later that evening, Sansa hosted a modest feast in the Great Hall, an effort to show hospitality, though Winterfell's supplies were stretched. Stewed onions, bread trenchers, and salted meats formed the bulk of the meal. Honeyed wine, heated by the fire, was served to ward off the chill. The hall was filled with the murmur of conversation, and Daenerys took a seat at the high table with Jaime, Sansa, and Arya. Their talk revolved around strategizing how to gather more northern bannermen, how to best fortify the region, and whether to send riders beyond the wall for more information. Tormund Giantsbane, a red-bearded wildling leader who had joined forces with Jon Snow in the past, was said to be somewhere near Castle Black, rallying other free folk. Daenerys expressed a desire to meet him, to glean first-hand accounts of what lay beyond the wall. Sansa agreed to send word, though she cautioned that Tormund might be in transit or possibly cut off by winter storms. Arya quietly stated that if Tormund could not come to them, she would volunteer to go beyond the wall herself. The boldness of that offer made Jaime glance at her sharply, but Sansa did not outwardly protest. Perhaps she recognized that Arya was more capable than she appeared. That night, Daenerys and Jaime took quarters in the old tower that had been prepared for them. The rushes on the floor were fresh, but the wind howled through cracks in the stone, and a brazier glowed faintly to provide heat. Daenerys removed her gloves, rubbing warmth into her cold fingers, and Jaime stood by the small window, gazing into the darkness. The faint silhouettes of the dragons could be seen in the courtyard below, blending with the shadows. He spoke in a subdued tone. "If this threat is real, and it seems it may be, do you think it can unite the realm long enough to fight back? Or will old grudges tear us apart before we ever face these creatures?" She exhaled, the breath turning to white mist. "It must unite us, or we'll all perish. The living cannot afford to remain divided. Even Cersei must see reason, if the threat is proven." But a flicker of doubt passed over her face. "Though I suspect she might refuse to believe anything that doesn't serve her immediate interests." Jaime closed his eyes briefly, recalling the conversation with Cersei before he left. She had made no promise to send reinforcements north, no sign that she would even care if the rumors were true. Instead, she had only warned him not to get himself killed chasing fairy tales. "I'll write to her, if only to keep her informed," he said. "But I doubt she'll respond with anything but disdain." Daenerys moved closer, resting a hand on his arm. "I know this weighs on you," she said gently. "She's your sister, but we have a duty to all the people of Westeros, not just to her." A bitter line formed around Jaime's mouth. "I know. It's just, I remember a time when I would have done anything for her." He let out a low breath, glancing away. "That time is past." Daenerys looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the echoes of all the conflicts that had shaped him. She did not speak further, for some truths were best left to settle unspoken. Instead, she took his good hand in hers and squeezed gently, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. Days turned into a routine of planning and reconnaissance. Word came that Tormund and a group of wildlings would arrive at Winterfell soon, bringing whatever intelligence they possessed. Daenerys spent hours with Sansa, Arya, and the northern lords assessing potential battlegrounds, supply routes, and fallback positions should the threat prove real. Jaime inspected Winterfell's walls, conversing with the guards about watch rotations and possible improvements to fortifications. He also oversaw the forging of dragonglass-dipped spears in the smithy, where blacksmiths hammered away at the mysterious black rock shipped from Dragonstone. Whenever the wind calmed enough, Daenerys took Regal or Viserion into the skies, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The harsh white expanses seemed endless, broken only by patches of pine forest and jagged hills. Jaime sometimes watched her from the battlements, marveling at the silhouette of a dragon rider against the pale winter sun. Northern folk occasionally gathered to watch as well, a mix of apprehension and awe on their faces. At last, Tormund Giant's Bane arrived, accompanied by a grim-faced band of wildlings, many of them clad in furs with frost clinging to their beards. The moment he entered Winterfell's gates, he demanded to see the Dragon Queen, as he called Daenerys, and the Wolf Girl, by which he meant Sansa or Arya, the distinctions not entirely clear to him. He was escorted to the Great Hall, where Daenerys awaited him with Sansa, Arya, Jaime, and Grey Worm. Tormund wasted no time in pleasantries. After stamping snow from his boots, he glared around the hall as though suspecting traps. Finally, he spoke in a booming voice, recounting what he had witnessed beyond the wall. According to him, the Night's King, an ancient legend among the free folk, had indeed risen, commanding an army of wights numbered in the tens of thousands. They moved slowly but relentlessly, and any living being they killed rose again to join their ranks. The wildlings had fled south in droves, some scattering, some regrouping. The Night's Watch had tried to hold Eastwatch, but Tormund claimed it had fallen to an onslaught of undead. The only reason he and some survivors escaped was because they knew secret ways through the icy cliffs. Sansa's face grew pale as Tormund detailed how the Whites attacked, in silent waves, unafraid of conventional weapons. The White Walkers themselves, tall and gaunt with glowing blue eyes, wielded blades that could freeze steel and shatter ordinary swords. Even describing them seemed to unnerve the wildling leader, though he was too proud to admit fear outright. He concluded by slamming a massive fist on the table. "If we don't stop them, they'll roll over the north like a storm of death. Don't matter if you've got pretty dragons or fancy keep walls. They'll keep coming." Jaime exchanged a glance with Daenerys, feeling a grim certainty settle in. This was no story conjured by fearful peasants. The wildlings had indeed faced a real threat, and it was marching south. Daenerys squared her shoulders. "We have dragonglass. We have dragons. We will fight them." Tormund eyed her. "Fight them you must, but you'll need every army, every man who can hold a spear, and you'll need to put aside all those squabbles you Southerners love so much. Because if even one side tries to hold back, the army of the dead will tear you all to pieces." Sansa cleared her throat, regaining composure. "Then we must send word to all the major houses, Tyrell, Martell, Baratheon loyalists in Storm's End, the Vale, and yes, House Lannister." She paused, flicking her gaze at Jaime. "Queen Daenerys, this can be the moment you truly unify the realm, by calling every lord to face a common foe." Daenerys nodded, though she knew it would be no simple matter. "We'll send ravens from Winterfell to all corners of the Seven Kingdoms. We must make them understand this is a danger to us all." "Jaime?" She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Will Cersei respond to such a plea?" He hesitated. "If she believes it, perhaps. But she's proven adept at dismissing truths she finds inconvenient. We'll need to give her undeniable proof. Perhaps she'll heed the testimony of multiple witnesses, or perhaps not." Arya, who had been silent, spoke in a low voice. "What if we bring a white to her? Show her that the dead truly walk." A murmur rippled around the table. Jaime considered the idea. Madness on the face of it, but perhaps the only means to convince a skeptic like Cersei. "It could be done," he said slowly, "though capturing one would be incredibly dangerous." Tormund snorted. "You'd have to be madder than a then to try. But if that's what it takes to get your Southern Queen to see sense, I won't say no to the help." Daenerys sighed. She had no desire to risk her men on such a mission, but she also saw the logic. If the entire realm united, the chance of victory soared. If Cersei sat idle in King's Landing and the Lannister forces withheld their men, the war against the undead might be lost before it began. "We'll consider it carefully," she said. "But for now, let's send out ravens bearing Tormund's testimony and our own warnings. We'll ask the lords to send men north, and we will prepare Winterfell to be our main stronghold." The hours that followed were consumed by frantic planning. Scribes and maesters wrote letters at a furious pace, sealing them with wax and dispatching ravens to every major keep in Westeros. Daenerys drafted personal letters to Margaery Tyrell in Highgarden, to the Martells in Dorne, to the Lords of the Vale, and to the Stormlands. She included pleas that they take the threat seriously, urging them to gather their banners and march north. Sansa sent out her own letters to the northern houses, calling them to Winterfell. Jaime penned a letter to Cersei. He kept it brief yet forceful, describing Tormund's first-hand account and imploring her not to dismiss the danger. The message also carried a personal note, reminding her of the devastation that would befall all of them if they did not unite. He doubted Cersei would heed him, but he had to try. Over the following week, the first trickle of bannermen arrived. Houses Manderley, Glover, Serwyn, and others heeded Sansa's call, bringing small retinues. They braved icy roads to gather beneath the direwolf banner at Winterfell. Some came more out of fear or duty than genuine belief in the undead threat. Still, their presence bolstered the fortress's defenses. The blacksmiths worked day and night, forging spears, arrowheads, and swords from dragonglass. The yard rang with the sound of hammer on anvil. Daenerys oversaw the training of her forces alongside the northern warriors, forging a sense of unity through shared drills and shared hardships. Unsullied practiced side by side with Stark bannermen, while the Dothraki sparred with wildlings. Mutual mistrust was rife, but the threat of annihilation had a remarkable way of uniting those who would otherwise be enemies. Jaime, for his part, moved among them, giving pointers where he could, though he still felt a pang of self-consciousness about his diminished sword hand. He settled for instructing and encouraging, demonstrating technique with his remaining hand. Surprisingly, some of the younger recruits listened with respect, having heard legends of his skill. Outside Winterfell, the snow kept falling. Patrols rode out in all directions, searching for any sign of whites or White Walkers. The silence of the winter wasteland felt oppressive, as though something stirred in the distance, just out of sight. Each day that dawned without an attack felt like borrowed time. One morning, Daenerys decided to take Rhaegal up for an extended flight, hoping to scout as far as the wall itself. Jaime insisted on joining her, though she raised an eyebrow at the thought of a passenger. Flying with another person was not something she usually did, except on rare occasions. Nevertheless, they prepared for it. Jaime wore thick leathers and furs, strapping himself behind Daenerys on Rhaegal's back, arms circling her waist for stability. The dragon snorted, unaccustomed to the added weight, but obeyed Daenerys's commands. They launched into the icy air, wings beating powerfully. Jaime's breath caught in his throat at the sheer rush of it. The ground fell away so quickly, and soon Winterfell's walls looked like a child's toy below them. The wind stung his face, and his heart pounded with an odd mix of exhilaration and unease. Daenerys guided Rhaegal northward, where the terrain grew ever more hostile. Snowy plains, frozen rivers, and jagged ridges stretched out in a desolate panorama. As they neared the wall, or what remained visible of it, Jaime glimpsed the massive structure looming in the distance like a white cliff carved by giants. Even from this vantage, parts of it looked damaged, confirming Tormund's account that Eastwatch had suffered a breach. The sky above was leaden, the light uncertain, and an eerie hush enveloped them. Daenerys circled Rhaegal around a broken section where the ocean met the ice, scanning for any movement below. The cold was fierce, almost unbearable. Then Jaime spotted something. Dark shapes moving across the bleak expanse near the broken edge of the wall. It was difficult to discern details from this height, but they seemed numerous, and they moved in an unnatural, synchronized manner. He tapped Daenerys' shoulder, pointing. She guided Rhaegal lower, though not so low as to risk arrow fire or other dangers. As they descended, the shapes became clearer, figures trudging through the snow, and if Jaime's eyes did not deceive him, some of them wore tatters of clothing, while others looked entirely skeletal. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather shot through Jaime's spine. The undead, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, marching slowly across the icy terrain. At their head, or near it, rode tall, pale riders on undead horses. White walkers. Their eyes glowed like blue embers even from this distance. Daenerys sucked in a sharp breath. She had never witnessed such a sight. The wave of corpses, trudging onward in eerie silence, dwarfed any cavalry or infantry she had ever commanded. Jaime clutched at her waist, feeling the press of fear in his gut. One of the White Walkers seemed to glance upward, as though it sensed the dragon overhead. Rhaegal roared, sending a streak of flame across the sky, but they were too high for it to reach the army below. In response, a chilling wind gusted up, as if the cold itself answered the challenge. Daenerys struggled to keep Rhaegal steady against the sudden swirl of icy air. She and Jaime exchanged a look of grim confirmation. This was beyond anything they had imagined. The host of the dead stretched far to the east and west, an unholy legion that might number in the tens of thousands, just as Tormund had said. One thing became immediately clear. If that army reached Winterfell or any other fortress, it would be a siege unlike any in living memory. After circling one more time to observe, Daenerys urged Rhaegal back southward, not wanting to risk drawing the attention of whatever dark magic guided the undead. On the flight back, neither she nor Jaime spoke much. The reality of the threat pressed on them like a physical weight. When at last they landed in Winterfell's courtyard, a flurry of attendants and curious onlookers rushed to meet them. Daenerys slid off Rhaegal's back, face pale with shock. Jaime followed, nearly stumbling as his boots hit the cobblestones. Sansa emerged from the keep, scanning their faces. "What is it?" she asked urgently, noting their shaken expressions. Daenerys steadied herself. "They're coming," she replied, her voice hoarse. "We saw them, an army of the dead, led by White Walkers. It's no rumor. They're already on the move, heading south from the breach near Eastwatch." A profound hush settled over the courtyard. The flickering torches cast shifting shadows across the stone, and Jaime noticed the expressions of the northern soldiers. Some blanched, some gripped their spears, others muttered prayers under their breath. Arya, standing beside Sansa, set her jaw in a tight line, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger as though that might somehow help against such a foe. Sansa nodded grimly. "Then we must prepare for war at once." Inside the Great Hall, Daenerys and Jaime relayed what they had witnessed. Tormund only confirmed it further, describing how the undead traveled, unstopping, never sleeping. The question became not if they would reach Winterfell, but when. By Tormund's estimate, they could arrive in weeks, perhaps less, depending on conditions. The forbidding winter roads might slow them, but not by much. Daenerys summoned the northern lords and her own commanders to council. There, they laid out a desperate plan. They would fortify Winterfell to its utmost, gather every man and woman who could fight, distribute dragonglass weapons, and position the dragons, Rhaegal, Viserion, and when the time came, possibly Drogon, at strategic points. Yet even with all this, the odds seemed daunting. If the undead horde was truly as massive as it appeared, Winterfell might become the site of a last stand. One lord suggested retreating further south to consolidate with the Vale or with any reinforcements from the Riverlands. But Tormund and Sansa both countered that the further south the undead traveled, the more corpses they would add to their ranks. Villagers, animals, anything that died became part of the enemy. Better to meet them in the north with a fortress that had stood for thousands of years. Meanwhile, ravens kept returning with responses from across the realm. Marjorie Tyrell's letter pledged support, though gathering her bannermen and marching north would take time. She promised to depart as soon as possible. The Martells of Dorne remained uncertain but hinted they might send a token force. The Vale, under Littlefinger's guidance, wrote back in perfunctory terms that they would consider sending knights if the threat was proven. Casterly Rock's steward, acting in the name of House Lannister, acknowledged the Queen's summons but was non-committal, likely awaiting word from Cersei. which left the largest potential force in the south. The Crownlands and the Lannisters loyal to the Queen in King's Landing, if Cersei chose to deploy them. But the reply from Cersei that eventually arrived was a masterpiece of evasion. She wrote that she had received Jaime's letter and Daenerys' summons. While she had the utmost concern for any threat to the realm, she insisted that the Queen would have to come to King's Landing to provide definitive proof before she risked the city's defenses. The letter ended with a mild rebuke, implying that if Daenerys was so desperate for the Lannisters' help, she should show proper courtesy by traveling to the capital. Daenerys read the parchment by lamplight, lips tightening. "She's playing games while an army of the dead marches south," she said coldly, passing the letter to Jaime. Jaime's jaw set as he read his sister's words. "That's Cersei," he said quietly. "She won't commit unless she's certain. If she senses any weakness, she'll exploit it to remain in power. She might be willing to let the North burn, hoping the threat dies off before reaching her gates." Some called for ignoring Cersei altogether, labeling her a fool. Others insisted that if they could not convince her to march north, they must at least prevent her from attacking them in the rear. As the nights dragged on, Daenerys, Jaime, Sansa, and the northern lords wrestled with these dilemmas. Finally, an uneasy decision emerged. A small party would indeed travel south to King's Landing, bringing one of the captured whites, if they could capture one alive. That would force Cersei to see the truth. But capturing a white was no simple feat. It required venturing perilously close to the undead army, snatching a single white, and escaping without being overrun. Tormund volunteered immediately, as did several wildlings. Arya Stark offered her services, and so did a few Dothraki warriors who found the idea of such a daring mission a worthy challenge. Jaime surprised them all by stepping forward. "I'll go," he said, voice quiet but certain. "If I ask my sister to believe in this threat, I should be there to show her the proof. She might be less inclined to call it trickery if I'm the one bringing it." Daenerys felt a stab of concern. The mission was fraught with danger, and losing Jaime would be a blow both personal and political. Yet she also saw the logic. "Then I'll have to send someone with you who can command the dragons if needed," she said. "Rhaegal can bear one rider, but that leaves Viserion." Grey Worm, hearing this, expressed a willingness to join, but he was needed at Winterfell to oversee the Unsullied. Ultimately, Jorah Mormont, who had arrived from Bear Island after hearing of the new war, stepped forward, offering to go. He had served Daenerys for years, though their relationship was complicated by his past betrayals. Still, she trusted his bravery. The final group was small but formidable. Jaime, Jorah, Tormund, Arya, and a handful of wildlings and Dothraki. They planned to ride northeast, skirt around the main undead host, and try to capture a white from its periphery. It was a suicide mission by any measure, but they had dragonglass weapons and the possibility of aerial support from Rhaegal and Viserion if things went dire. Daenerys insisted she would not risk all 3 dragons so far from Winterfell, not with the full army of the dead nearby. But if Rhaegal and Viserion could quickly swoop in and out, it might give the party a chance to escape. On the eve of their departure, Jaime found Daenerys alone in Winterfell's Godswood, standing beneath the Heart Tree. Snow dusted her hair and cloak, and she looked at the ancient face carved into the weirwood as though seeking guidance. A hush lay over the courtyard, broken only by the distant sound of the smithy. He approached, noticing how the red leaves contrasted with the snow. "It's cold," he said softly. "You should come in." She glanced at him, half smiling. "I've seen colder." Then she sighed. "You leave tomorrow. Have you any doubts?" He hesitated. "Many, but I'm certain it must be done, or Cersei will never believe us." A wry note entered his voice. "And if she won't fight, the realm is lost, one way or another." Daenerys nodded. "You're right, and yet, I wish there were another way, a safer way. This plan terrifies me." He reached for her gloved hand, gently clasping it. "I'll return," he promised, though they both knew such promises were tenuous in these times. "We'll bring proof to King's Landing. We'll force Cersei to see sense." She said nothing at first, then slid her hand from his, lifted it to his cheek, and leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. It was a brief, silent communion, perhaps the closest they had come to expressing genuine tenderness since their marriage. In the hush of the godswood, the drifting snow collecting on their shoulders, they let the weight of the moment pass between them. When dawn broke, the small party assembled in the courtyard. Horses stamped the ground, their breath steaming in the chill. Arya checked her gear, dragonglass-tipped arrows and the Valyrian steel dagger she carried. Tormund teased one of the Dothraki about the cold, while the Dothraki man grinned back with equal bravado. Yora stood stoically, ensuring they had enough supplies to last the perilous journey. Jaime wore his fur-lined cloak over armor that had been reinforced around his left side to account for the golden hand. He carried a dragonglass sword sheathed at his hip, though he knew he would rely more on cunning than on raw skill in this environment. Daenerys was there to see them off. She rested a hand on Rhaegal's flank, the dragon huffing impatient clouds of steam, while Viserion crouched nearby. It had been agreed that Rhaegal would accompany the expedition part of the way, with Yora riding him, ready to summon the beast for extraction if the group found themselves overwhelmed. Viserion would remain in reserve, circling near Winterfell, in case the undead tried a flanking maneuver. Sansa and Arya exchanged a quick embrace, though Arya's expression remained determined. "Don't worry," she told her sister. "I'll be back before the real war starts." Sansa's eyes glimmered with concern, but she nodded, trusting in her sister's skill. Jaime approached Daenerys, bowing his head. "Your Grace," he said formally, glancing around the courtyard bustling with watchers. He could not display too much intimacy in public, but he allowed a small, private smile to cross his face. "I'll bring you your proof." She inclined her head, matching his tone. "And I'll prepare the realm to receive it." A flicker of worry crossed her eyes. "Keep them safe," she added softly, "and keep yourself safe." With that, the party rode out through Winterfell's gates, pushing northeast into the frozen wilds. A hush seemed to fall over the watchers left behind. The mission had begun, and every soul in Winterfell understood the peril that lay ahead. Daenerys lingered by the gates, her cloak whipping around her legs in the frigid wind, watching until the riders vanished into the swirling snow. Only then did she turn away, quietly praying to whatever gods might listen that they would succeed. What followed was a grueling journey across a barren, frost-shrouded landscape. The horses struggled through snowdrifts, and the cold bit into flesh and bone. Nights were spent huddled around sparse campfires, the howling wind drowning out conversation. Jaime found himself riding beside Arya at times, though she spoke little, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Tormund led the way, relying on his knowledge of the wild lands north of the Wall. Yora and the Dothraki warriors brought up the rear, ensuring no one fell behind. After several days, they drew close to the area where Jaime and Daenerys had spotted the undead host from the sky. Tormund scouted ahead, returning with grim news. The army was still on the march, but a small band of stragglers, likely whites, had fallen behind or wandered off. This was their chance to capture one without drawing the entire host. However, the group would need to be swift and avoid any White Walkers that might be directing the whites. They planned the ambush in hushed tones. Yora would remain mounted on Rhaegal some distance away, watching from the air. At the signal, if things turned dire, he would swoop in. The rest would attempt to encircle the isolated whites, slay all but one, and drag the captive back. A reckless plan, but it was all they had. Near dusk, they spotted the whites, a group of about half a dozen, shuffling aimlessly among the rocks and snow. Some wore tattered armor, others ragged cloaks. Their eyes glowed a ghastly blue. The sight made Jaime's stomach churn. Death animated these corpses with a hideous parody of life. He felt a surge of repulsion mixed with fear. Tormund signaled the approach. The hunters fanned out, each carrying dragonglass-dipped spears or blades. Arya notched a dragonglass arrow. Jaime gripped his sword's hilt, the golden hand steadying it. The Dothraki men brandished their araks, trembling slightly with adrenaline. They struck from multiple angles at once, aiming to dispatch the whites quickly. Arya's first arrow shattered a white skull, sending it crumpling into a heap. Tormund cleaved another in half with a furious swing of his axe. One of the Dothraki beheaded a third, but before it could collapse, another white sprang forward with unnatural speed, raking its frozen claws across the warrior's face. He screamed, staggering back with blood streaming. Jaime lunged to help, thrusting his dragonglass sword into the white's chest. The creature shrieked and disintegrated in a swirl of brittle flesh. Two more whites lurched forward, snapping their jaws. Tormund smashed one to pieces, but the last white threatened to slip away. Arya darted in front of it, agile as a cat, but the creature hissed and clawed at her. Jaime rushed to intercept, ramming the white aside with his shoulder. His heart thundered as he swung his blade, aiming for its legs to disable it. The white collapsed, hissing and thrashing. "We need it alive," Tormund roared, brandishing a set of chains. Jaime and Arya grappled with the creature as it flailed, snapping its blackened teeth. Every movement felt like a brush with death. Finally, Tormund managed to loop the chains around the white's torso and arms, binding it tightly. It shrieked, a sound that made Jaime's blood run cold. Suddenly, a keening wail echoed across the frozen plains, chilling them all to the core. It was not the white they had captured, but something else. A horn-like cry that reverberated in the distance. Tormund cursed. "That's a White Walker call. They know we're here." Jaime glanced around, heart pounding. Shadows emerged on the edge of their vision. More whites, perhaps dozens, scuttling through the snowfall. They were not alone. They had stirred a hornet's nest. "We have what we came for," Arya shouted, eyes flashing. "Fall back." Yora, circling above on Regal, must have seen the danger because a roar cut through the howling wind. The dragon descended, unleashing a torrent of fire that lit up the twilight in a blaze of orange. White screamed, igniting like kindling. Yet more kept coming, drawn to the noise and the smell of the living. Amid the chaos, Jaime clung to the captive white's chain, hauling it behind him while Tormund helped the injured Dothraki. Arya covered their flank with lethal efficiency, sending arrow after arrow into the onrushing undead. Yora and Regal strafed the ground with fire, but the swirling wind and snow made it difficult to maintain precision. The stench of burned flesh and the roar of flame filled the air. Retreating quickly, they managed to mount their horses or cling to Yora's saddle if they were near the dragon. The captive white, still howling and thrashing, was tied behind one of the horses, dragged along through the snow. They rode with all possible speed, whites pursuing them in a mindless stampede. The thunder of hooves and the savage hiss of undead formed a terrifying cacophony. Jaime cast one glance over his shoulder, seeing a tall, pale shape lurking amid the swirling snow. A White Walker, spear raised, eyes fixed on the fleeing group. The sight of that inhuman gaze burned itself into Jaime's mind before the swirling wind hid it from view. Narrowly, they outpaced the undead, aided by Regal's fiery onslaught that scorched the ground behind them. The whites slowed or were forced to seek another path around the flames. By the time the group reached a more open stretch of land, they had gained enough distance to regroup. Yora directed Regal skyward to keep watch. Tormund and Arya, breathing heavily, checked the wounded Dothraki warrior. He was alive, though badly clawed, and they quickly cauterized his wounds with a heated blade. Jaime slumped in his saddle, exhaustion gnawing at him, though relief coursed through his veins. They had survived. And more importantly, they had captured a white, now a snarling abomination half-wrapped in furs and chains, dragging behind one of the horses. No one spoke for a moment, the weight of what they had done settling on them. The mission was a success, albeit at a grim cost. One wildling had been killed in the skirmish, his body ripped apart by whites, and a Dothraki was severely injured. Blood stained the snow, a dark reminder that no victory came without sacrifice in these haunted wastes. Finally, Arya broke the silence. "We have our proof," she said, voice tight. "Let's get it to Winterfell, and then to King's Landing." Jaime nodded, looking at the white with revulsion. Its milky eyes rolled in its head, bound jaws snapping uselessly. This was the horror they had to show Cersei, and if it could convince her, maybe the realm stood a chance. Tormund led them south again, taking a less direct route to avoid running into the main body of the undead. Every step of the journey felt fraught with danger. How many more wights prowled the area, drawn by the sounds of conflict? Jorah and Rhaegal provided aerial oversight, though swirling snow limited visibility. They pressed on, day and night, stopping only briefly to rest. The captive wight never ceased its frenzied struggle, rattling chains and letting out hollow snarls. No one slept easily. When at last they reached the outskirts of Winterfell, the defenders atop the walls peered down with wide eyes at the monstrous figure struggling against its bonds. Word spread like wildfire through the castle. Jaime, Arya, and the others had returned, and they had brought something unspeakable with them. Daenerys emerged, flanked by Sansa and Grey Worm, to witness the group's arrival. The sight of the wight, shrieking and clawing, nearly made her recoil. Even having heard the stories, seeing it in the flesh was a shock. They brought the creature into the courtyard, where Daenerys examined it from a cautious distance. The wight snapped its teeth, eyes glowing. Tormund kept a firm grip on the chains. Daenerys's lips pressed into a thin line. "So this is what awaits us," she murmured, horror mingling with resolve. Jaime dismounted, nearly stumbling from fatigue. He bowed his head to Daenerys. "We have our proof. Now we must take it to King's Landing, if you still believe that's wise." She nodded grimly. "I do. If this doesn't convince Cersei, nothing will." Sansa, pale-faced, eyed the creature. "Gods help us all if it doesn't," she said under her breath. In the days that followed, the plan solidified. A small delegation would ride south with the wight carefully guarded. Daenerys intended to go herself, along with Jaime, a token of trust and an assertion of authority. Jorah and Grey Worm would remain at Winterfell to coordinate defenses with Sansa. The Dothraki and Unsullied armies would stay put, fortifying for the eventual battle. Arya, after some debate, decided to stay behind as well, determined to protect Winterfell and Sansa. Tormund would also remain. The free folk needed his leadership. Before they departed, the watchers on the walls reported ominous sightings. Flickers of movement near the horizon, strange lights at night. The undead host was inching ever closer, like an unstoppable glacier. Time was short. If Cersei would rally her armies, they needed her decision soon. Thus, Daenerys and Jaime set forth from Winterfell once more, this time heading for the capital, trailed by a caravan that included the gruesome captive wight bound in an iron-barred cage mounted on a wagon. Accompanying them were a handful of trusted warriors and maesters, plus Rhaegal and Viserion overhead for protection. The journey south felt surreal, a race against time, as if the icy jaws of death snapped at their heels. A week later, they reached the Neck, then the Riverlands, where the snows receded slightly, replaced by freezing rain and muddy roads. Whispers spread ahead of them. The Dragon Queen traveled with a monstrous captive from beyond the wall. Fear and curiosity drew small crowds wherever they passed, though Daenerys kept the wight hidden beneath tarps to avoid panic. Finally, they approached the familiar gates of King's Landing. The city's skyline was just visible in the distance, its walls imposing despite the realm's turmoil. Daenerys felt a coil of tension in her gut as she recalled the last time she was here, when she took the throne and Tommen still lived. Jaime rode beside her, silent, preoccupied with thoughts of his sister's likely response. Above them, Rhaegal and Viserion soared, their roars echoing. Some in the city would cower at the sound. Others might be reminded of the realm's new reality. The capital's gates opened, albeit warily, as if bracing for a siege. They passed into the streets, flanked by gold cloaks who eyed the dragons above with tight-jawed apprehension. Crowds gathered, gossiping in hushed tones about the wagon under heavy guard. Daenerys maintained a regal bearing, Jaime at her side. She spotted the red keep rising above the city, a symbol of power and betrayal all at once. At last, they were ushered into the courtyard of the Red Keep, where a small welcoming party awaited them. Cersei Lannister stood at its head, garbed in black and gold. Behind her loomed Ser Robert Strong, the reanimated Mountain, and several other members of the Queen's Guard. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Daenerys dismounted with poise, while Jaime slid off his horse, exchanging a brief, unreadable glance with Cersei. Daenerys spoke first, voice echoing off the stone walls. "I come as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms to show you the threat we face in the north." She signaled to the guards, who began to unfasten the tarp covering the caged wight. "If you do not believe what you see, then the realm is doomed." Cersei's gaze shifted to the cage, suspicion in her eyes. She glanced at Jaime but said nothing yet. The gold cloaks and onlookers watched, hushed. Slowly, Daenerys's men dragged the cage forward, unveiling the bound wight within. It screeched at once, lunging against its chains, its undead eyes locking onto the nearest living beings. A few onlookers recoiled in horror, stepping back. Cersei's expression flickered. Disgust, shock, perhaps fear. Carefully, Daenerys's guard unlatched part of the cage, letting the wight surge out a foot or two before yanking it back on its chains. The creature snarled, jaws snapping inches from Cersei's feet. Ser Robert Strong stepped forward, but Cersei raised a hand to stop him. She stared at the wight, taking in its rotted flesh and the unnatural glow of its eyes. Then, in a voice etched with mingled rage and fascination, she asked, "What is this abomination?" Jaime spoke up, his tone subdued. Proof of an enemy that threatens us all. The army of the dead marches south. If we do not unite, King's Landing will fall. Every city will fall." Silence stretched. The wight continued thrashing, spitting black ichor, its guttural moans filling the courtyard. Cersei's eyes were fixed on it, face pale but composed. Eventually, she raised her gaze to Daenerys. "So you expect me to commit my armies to the north, leaving the capital unguarded on the basis of this?" She gestured to the cage. "How do I know you won't use the opportunity to seize even greater power?" Daenerys's jaw tightened. "Because if the dead triumph, there will be no power left to seize, and you will lose everything. Your city, your throne, your life." For a moment, the old spark of defiance flashed in Cersei's eyes, as if she might dismiss the entire spectacle as trickery. But the white snarls were no mere illusions. The reanimated corpse was clearly, undeniably real. Her glance flicked to Jaime. She saw the raw determination in his face, the silent plea not to ignore the truth in front of her. Finally, Cersei spoke with a clipped tone that concealed a whirlwind of emotion. "Very well. I will speak with you privately. If the threat is as dire as you claim, we shall discuss terms." She turned on her heel, black skirts swirling, and strode into the Red Keep. Daenerys let out a slow breath. She glanced at Jaime. Neither allowed themselves relief yet. They knew Cersei's cunning too well. This was only the beginning of negotiations, and the fate of the realm hung in the balance. They followed Cersei inside, leaving the wight caged behind them, still hissing at the living, a harbinger of the war to come. That was how Daenerys Targaryen and Jaime Lannister came to stand once more in the halls of the Red Keep, facing a woman who might be the realm's last hope for unity or its greatest obstacle. The dead were on the march, unstoppable in their advance unless the living could set aside their endless conflicts. And so, in the heart of King's Landing, surrounded by old betrayals and fresh horrors, they prepared for the negotiation that would determine if the Seven Kingdoms could survive the long night or if they would perish as one more chapter in the kingdom of the dead. Daenerys Targaryen followed Cersei Lannister into the Red Keep, the echo of the caged wight's feral snarling still reverberating through her mind. She did not look over her shoulder at Jaime, who walked just behind her. Instead, she focused on the woman leading them into the castle's shadowy corridors. Though Daenerys had presumed that wearing the crown made her the highest authority in the land, she was reminded now that the Game of Thrones rarely yielded to any single power. Cersei's subtle control within these crimson halls remained palpable. Guards bowed and murmured courtesies as she passed, and Daenerys felt a wave of caution roll through her. Even with wights at the doorstep of humanity, The old politics of distrust and ambition might easily undermine everything. Cersei led them to a small council chamber overlooking a courtyard, its windows fitted with stained glass tinted in red and gold. When she stopped, her retinue halted as well. Ser Robert Strong in his massive plate, a few Queensguard knights, and 2 handmaidens who hovered at a discreet distance. Cersei turned, gesturing that Daenerys and Jaime should follow her inside. One of the Queensguard made to enter, but Cersei raised a hand in silent dismissal. The guard inclined his head, stepping back without protest. Daenerys set her jaw, stepping across the threshold. Jaime followed, and the wooden door closed behind them with a dull thud, leaving the 3 of them alone. Within the chamber, a single long table stretched across the floor, flanked by a trio of high-backed chairs. A modest fireplace crackled, its flames illuminating a carved mantle bearing the Lannister lion. The walls smelled faintly of old parchment and wax. A decanter of wine and 3 gilded cups sat on the table, as though arranged for a civil discussion rather than the desperate negotiation it truly was. Cersei moved to stand near the fireplace, crossing her arms beneath her breasts. She was dressed in a severe black gown trimmed with gold filigree, her once-long hair cropped in a coolly practical style. Shadows accentuated the hollows of her cheeks. "We've seen your proof," she said, her voice edged with a tension Daenerys could not entirely decipher. Was it fear, anger, or a mixture of both? "And it's monstrous enough. But I want to know the full truth. How large is this undead army? How fast do they move? Is there any true hope of stopping them?" Daenerys stepped forward. "The horde numbers in the tens of thousands. Likely more. It moves slowly but without rest. Each victory they claim, each person or creature they kill, bolsters their ranks. The White Walkers control them, using some magic we barely understand." She paused, exhaling. "Dragonglass and fire are among the few weapons that work against them. My dragons have proven effective, but we only have 3. For an army that size, we need every sword, every spear, every soldier." Cersei's brow remained furrowed in concentration. She flicked her gaze to Jaime. "And you believe her completely? You, who once warned me never to trust a Targaryen." Jaime inclined his head. "I've seen them with my own eyes, Cersei. I helped capture the White in your courtyard." A faint tremor entered his voice. "It's like nothing I've witnessed, not in Robert's rebellion, not in the War of the 5 Kings, not anywhere. If we don't unite, we'll all die." An uneasy silence stretched. The fire snapped, sending shadows rippling across the chamber walls. Cersei tapped a finger against her elbow, as though measuring the weight of every possibility. At last, she gestured to the table. "Sit." Daenerys complied, lowering herself into one of the chairs. Jaime took the other. Cersei sat last, directly across from them, letting her gaze pass between them. She poured wine for herself but did not immediately offer any to her guests. Her lips curved in a taut smile. "You come to me asking for help, even though you took the throne after Tommen's death and effectively usurped my position." She folded her hands beneath her chin, eyes gleaming. "You ask me to send my armies north, leaving King's Landing and the Crownlands exposed. And in return, what do I gain?" Daenerys kept her composure, though her annoyance flared. "Your survival, for a start, and the survival of the people you claim to rule. We are not here to debate petty grievances. The living must stand together." Cersei's gaze hardened. "Petty grievances, you say? My father once told me that when you tear one thread from the tapestry of power, the entire weave risks unraveling." She traced her gloved fingertips around the rim of her wine cup. "And if I commit my forces, will you expect me to bend the knee to you as well? Should my men fight and die for a queen who sits on the Iron Throne in my son's stead?" Daenerys chose her words carefully. "Tommen named me heir before he died. It was done with the support of the small council. He was your son, yes, but he was also king of the 7 kingdoms. I do not come here seeking your personal fealty, Cersei. I'm asking that you join the realm's defense. Once the war is won, if it can be won, there will be time to settle the rest." Cersei gave Jaime a narrow look. You are silent. Do you truly advocate for her cause? Jaime's jaw tightened. I advocate for the realm's cause. This threat is bigger than House Lannister, bigger than the Iron Throne. An exhalation of frustration slipped from Cersei's lips. She stared at Daenerys, the flickering firelight revealing the faint lines of exhaustion near her eyes. Very well. Let us imagine I agree to send my armies north. I will not simply fling them at the undead while you hold back. The Targaryen forces must be on the front lines as well, your dragons included. I will not commit my men to a war only to see House Lannister bled white, leaving you stronger in the aftermath. Daenerys nodded. My armies are already in the north. The Unsullied, the Dothraki, and Northern Bannermen. I've risked my own life to scout the undead. I've lost men capturing that white. I have no intention of using your forces as fodder. Our alliance must be genuine if it is to succeed. Cersei lifted the wine to her lips and sipped, eyes never leaving Daenerys's face. For a moment, Daenerys considered how this woman had once cast a shadow over the entire realm. Her cunning, her cruelty, her willingness to do anything for her children. Yet now those children were all gone, and she looked older, more brittle. You may be genuine, but the question remains whether I can trust you not to strike at me once the threat is ended. You have my word, Daenerys said, and I will add any oath you wish. I do not aim to destroy House Lannister. I was forced to seize power because the realm needed stability. But if we fail to stop the undead, the question of who sits on the throne becomes meaningless. The entire kingdom will be nothing but a graveyard. Cersei considered that, eyes distant. Her gaze flicked to Jaime once more. And you, do you vouch for her? As my brother, will you guarantee she holds to her end of the bargain? Jaime squared his shoulders. I do. And if you still doubt me, you're welcome to send your own advisors, your own guards, to the north to watch for betrayal. I'll accept it if it means we can stand united. Silence fell again. At length, Cersei murmured, Fine, then here is my condition. I will send Lannister forces north. My generals will fight alongside yours. But if we prevail and the undead are vanquished, I want a formal guarantee of autonomy for the Westerlands and the Crownlands. We will acknowledge you as queen, but we will retain self-governance for a set period, 10 years perhaps, so that House Lannister may rebuild its strength without fear of interference. Daenerys felt the immediate urge to protest. She thought of all the horrors House Lannister had inflicted across the realm. But she also recalled Sansa Stark's demands for northern autonomy and how she had granted a measure of it. The realm had become so fractured that to unify it fully by raw force alone might only invite endless rebellions. She considered the cost if she refused. Cersei would withhold her armies, or possibly sabotage them from behind. The North could not afford that. 10 years of partial autonomy, Daenerys repeated slowly, during which you still honor the crown's taxes and laws, but you have the right to govern local disputes as you see fit. Agreed. As long as you swear not to plot against the throne. Cersei's mouth twisted in a half-smile. If that satisfies your illusions of unity, so be it. She set her cup down firmly, wine sloshing. You'll have your alliance. We will muster every man we can spare. The gold might be harder to raise, but we'll see. Jaime exhaled a breath he'd not realized he was holding. And how soon can your forces be ready to march? Within a fortnight, Cersei said. But I won't go north myself. I'll remain in King's Landing to keep the city in order. My generals will lead the army. You, Jaime, will coordinate with them. Make certain everything is done properly. The last thing we need is a fool's rout that sends Lannister men to an icy doom for no reason. A wave of relief touched Daenerys, even as she felt uneasy about how easily Cersei had agreed. She knew enough of the Queen Dowager's cunning to suspect hidden agendas. Still, they had something resembling a pact. Then we'll hold to that plan. The White stays here until it's time to march, to show your lords and generals the truth. She paused. Do you require anything else? Or shall we end this council? Cersei stared at Daenerys for a heartbeat. Her lips pursed as though she might add more demands. But at last she nodded. For now, that will suffice." They rose, and Jaime opened the door to the corridor. Outside, the Queen's guard snapped to attention. Cersei smoothed her skirts, nodded curtly to Daenerys, then swept from the room, her retinue swirling after her like a sable tide. The hush that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Daenerys glanced at Jaime, who still had his hand on the door. "She agreed too quickly," Daenerys said in a low murmur. "I expected more of a struggle." Jaime nodded somberly. "I did too." He closed the door again so that no prying ears might overhear. "But let's not question it too openly. If we can rally the Lannister forces, that might make all the difference. Just be prepared. Cersei never relinquishes her advantage without a motive." Daenerys touched his arm lightly. "We'll keep our eyes open." "Thank you, Jaime. That negotiation would have been impossible without you." She hesitated. "I want to speak to Tyrion as soon as possible, to inform him of these developments." She realized with an uncomfortable lurch that she had not seen Tyrion since her arrival in King's Landing, though she knew he had ridden south some days before to help finalize certain details with Marjorie Tyrell. She wondered if he had arrived yet. Jaime's mouth twitched. "If he's in the city, we'll find him. Let's go." They stepped out into the corridor. The Red Keep's halls were lined with torches set in iron sconces, flickering light across the vaulted ceilings. Daenerys felt an unnerving déjà vu. A year ago she had come to King's Landing to claim the throne, her dragons circling overhead in a show of power, the small folk watching her entry with a mixture of dread and awe. Now the city seemed gripped by a heavier gloom. Even the hush in the corridors felt laden with the knowledge that something monstrous lurked far to the north. A chamberlain in Lannister livery approached, bowing deeply. "Your Grace, Ser Jaime, we have prepared apartments for you in Maegor's Holdfast. Will you retire, or would you like refreshment?" Daenerys eyed him. "Is Lord Tyrion Lannister in King's Landing?" The chamberlain straightened. "I believe Lord Tyrion arrived yesterday evening, Your Grace, and took rooms in the Tower of the Hand, where he once resided. He said he would seek an audience with you once you were at leisure." Daenerys nodded in approval. "Send a message to him. Have him meet me in my solar." Then she paused. "Is that solar still mine to use?" The chamberlain bowed again, a bit more stiffly. "But of course, Your Grace. Queen Cersei granted you the privilege upon your arrival." Jaime gave a small, humorless smile. "Lead the way." They followed the chamberlain through the twisting corridors, ascending a flight of steps to a set of gilded double doors. The man opened them, revealing a familiar space. A high-ceilinged room with tall windows overlooking Blackwater Bay, heavy curtains drawn back to let in the waning afternoon light. A carved wooden table and chairs occupied the center, while shelves lined with old ledgers and scrolls surrounded the walls. A brazier burned in the corner, fighting off the late autumn chill. The chamberlain bowed once more and departed. Daenerys took a slow breath, stepping forward to run her fingers along the surface of the table. So many decisions had been made here. She glanced over her shoulder at Jaime. "Feel free to make yourself at ease. We might be waiting a while for Tyrion." Jaime nodded, removing his leather gloves and setting them on a shelf. The golden prosthetic hand gleamed in the light, a jarring emblem of his past and present entwined. He glanced around, memories of the Red Keep swirling. The war, the tension, Joffrey's cruelty, his father's iron-fisted rule. Now, new memories layered on top, Daenerys' arrival, the negotiations in which he'd played a key role. How far he had come from the days when he believed his entire purpose was to stand at King Tommen's side, or linger in Cersei's shadow. Before either could speak further, footfalls approached from the corridor. The door swung open to admit Tyrion Lannister, short, with mismatched eyes full of keen intelligence, hair more peppered with silver than before, lines of worry marking his brow. He wore a plain doublet and cloak, no sign of extravagant finery. Behind him trailed a single guard from the Queen's retinue, who bowed and withdrew. Tyrion's gaze jumped from Daenerys to Jaime. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Tyrion let out a breath of near-exasperated relief, stepping forward. "Thank the gods you're here safely, Your Grace." I was worried the moment I heard you rode out of Winterfell with so few guards. And Jaime," he paused, forming a tight smile, "it's good to see you're alive. I half expected to find your head on a pike outside the city gates, courtesy of Cersei's temper." Jaime snorted. "She didn't try to have me killed. Yet." Daenerys gestured for Tyrion to come further into the room. "We've just finished a private audience with her. Surprisingly, she has agreed to send her armies north." Tyrion's eyebrows arched high. "Truly? She must be absolutely convinced of the undead threat, or else she's more cunning than we realize. Or both." He moved closer to the table, pressing his hands to its surface. "You said you brought a white to show her. That was your plan from the start?" Daenerys gave a terse nod. "We captured one at great cost. She's seen it. No illusions can survive that. Now she claims she'll muster her forces to march within a fortnight." Tyrion's expression darkened. "I've known my sister too long to trust such easy concessions. She may commit some token number of men, but I fear she's plotting a betrayal. Perhaps she means to strike at your forces once you're engaged in the north, or to hold back until the undead weaken us all, then sweep in to claim what's left." Jaime exhaled. "It's possible. She wants a guaranteed autonomy for the Westerlands and Crownlands for 10 years after we prevail. She demanded that in exchange for her support." Tyrion gave a short, humorless laugh. "Of course she did. She's always demanded more ground than she's willing to give. But if an illusion of autonomy is what it takes to get those troops, it might be worth the risk." He turned to Daenerys. "Still, we should prepare a contingency plan. We can't let her hold our flank hostage." Daenerys nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need to do it discreetly. The last thing we want is to push her into open hostility while we're trying to unify the realm." She settled in a chair, rubbing her temples. The journey from Winterfell, the negotiations, and the looming threat of the undead weighed on her. "Tyrion, were you able to speak with Margaery Tyrell?" Tyrion grimaced. "I was. She's rallied a fair portion of the Tyrell bannermen. With the devastation of the war and the deaths in her family, many lords are uncertain, but she retains an authority, particularly with the small folk who adore her, for a sizable host. She's agreed to march them north as well, though it may take time to gather them. She's also wary of Cersei's intentions, which is why she insisted on an official commitment from you that the Tyrell forces won't be left to fight alone if Lannister armies fail to show." Daenerys closed her eyes, summoning patience. "Very well. Once we return to Winterfell, I'll have Missandei draw up official documents ensuring equal protection for all forces engaged in the war. If House Tyrell marches, we'll provide them with dragons and unsullied reinforcements wherever possible." Tyrion glanced at Jaime. "And how is Cersei personally?" Jaime's jaw tensed. "Different than before. Harder, colder. She's lost all her children, Tyrion. Tommen's death shattered her. Yet she moves on, fueled by bitterness and a desire to maintain control at any cost." Tyrion nodded slowly, sadness flickering in his eyes. "I once believed she was incapable of genuine grief, but it appears I was wrong. Or perhaps she's simply transformed it into something far more dangerous." He shook his head. "We can't dwell on that. The undead threat is real, and if we fail to stop it, none of us survive." Daenerys rose from her chair, posture resolute despite her fatigue. "We return to Winterfell as soon as we can to organize the final defenses. The White will remain here for Cersei to display to her lords, and to keep them from calling this a trick." She paused. "But we have a chance, however slim. We have the North, the Vale, if Littlefinger keeps his word, the Tyrells, the Martells in Dorne, and now, apparently, House Lannister. Almost the entire realm at our side." Jaime and Tyrion exchanged a heavy glance. Tyrion said softly, "That has never happened, not even during Robert's rebellion. Perhaps we're forging a new era by necessity." Daenerys allowed a fleeting smile. "A new era, or the final one? Let us hope it's the former." She shifted her gaze to Jaime. "Will you remain in King's Landing to coordinate the Lannister march, or return north with me?" He hesitated. "Cersei wants me to supervise, yes, But if you'd prefer me at Winterfell, she shook her head. No, stay here for a few days. Ensure that the Lannister forces truly begin to muster. Confirm that supply lines are organized. I'll ride ahead with Tyrion and a small escort to rejoin our armies in the north. The dragons can carry us swiftly enough. She caught Jaime's eyes, reading the reluctance there. We don't have time for half measures, she added gently. I need you to guarantee she doesn't betray us in the opening days of the campaign. Jaime nodded, though his expression was fraught. Understood. I'll do what must be done. Tyrion cleared his throat. I'll accompany Her Grace to Winterfell, but I have a few matters to finalize here in King's Landing. Discussions with Marjorie's envoys, arrangements for potential supply routes. Give me a day or two to settle those, then we can depart. Daenerys accepted that. Fine. Meanwhile, I'll rest. Tomorrow, I'll speak again with Cersei, if she permits it, and finalize a few more details. This alliance must be as solid as we can make it. With that, they parted ways. Tyrion hurried off to track down old contacts in the city, while Jaime offered to walk Daenerys to her assigned quarters. Neither spoke much along the route. The Red Keep's corridors felt strangely quiet, as though the castle itself braced for the storm to come. Servants bustled with anxious efficiency, occasionally dropping into bows or curtsies as Daenerys passed. She noticed that some wore expressions of mingled awe and dread. Perhaps they had heard the white screams echo in the courtyard and wondered what new terror had befallen their world. Once they reached the set of ornate double doors leading to Maegor's Holdfast, two unsullied guards parted to let Daenerys enter. Jaime paused at the threshold, uncertain whether to follow. She glanced at him, a silent invitation in her eyes. One of the unsullied, Grey Worm's second-in-command, stepped aside, and Jaime realized Daenerys wanted him inside. The apartments were lavish in design but sparse in personal detail. None of the ornamentation or personal touches that might mark a long-term resident. A bed draped in velvet sat near the far wall, a fireplace crackled softly, and a single table with two chairs stood near the window. Daenerys removed her cloak, tossing it onto a chest near the door. She turned to Jaime, who lingered just inside, running his gaze over the space. She sank onto one of the chairs, exhaling as she gestured for him to sit opposite her. Strange, isn't it? She said in a low tone. I came here as a conqueror once. Now I come as a supplicant for an alliance. Jaime settled in the opposite chair. Strange indeed, but times change and we change with them. His golden hand rested on the table, glinting in the firelight. He flexed the mechanical fingers slightly, a habitual motion. Are you all right? You've carried so much on your shoulders these past weeks. A soft, humorless laugh escaped her. I'll be all right when the undead are gone and the realm is safe. Until then, I can't afford to be otherwise. She paused, studying his face. But you, how are you faring? You're in the heart of your family's seat of power, but on the opposite side from Cersei. Does it weigh on you? He let out a long breath. Yes, I can't pretend otherwise. She was my twin, my other half, for so long. Now I see her with new eyes. I see the bitterness consuming her, and it pains me. But I won't let that sway me from what must be done. His gaze steadied on Daenerys. I believe in you, believe it or not. Strange as that may sound, given our history, but I see no other path that keeps the realm alive. She reached across the table, resting her hand gently atop his golden one. The metal felt cool under her palm. Thank you, Jaime. Truly. We would not have convinced Cersei of anything without you. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the soft crackle of the fireplace a distant lullaby. Daenerys' thoughts turned to the unstoppable horde, the last glimpse she'd had of them from Rhaegal's back, a tide of death rolling south. She recalled the feeling of dread that had hollowed out her stomach. Though she had faced slavers, warlords, and tyrants, none resembled this existential threat. Night settled fully across King's Landing. From the window, they saw the faint flickers of torchlight in the city streets, a hush broken by the occasional bark of a dog or the clank of a guard's halberd. At length, Jaime rose to depart, explaining he should return to the Lannister quarters where he was lodged if only to maintain appearances. Daenerys walked him to the door, though she lingered when he turned back and met her gaze. "Be careful," she said in a low voice. "Cersei might resent you more than she lets on." He nodded, offering the barest smile. "I will. Sleep well, Your Grace." When he was gone, Daenerys felt the weight of loneliness press upon her. She wondered if this was how her father had felt in his final days of madness, though she quickly pushed the comparison aside, remembering that King Aerys had orchestrated cruelty and terror while she strove to preserve life. She would not allow his legacy to define her, nor would she let fear of madness warp her decisions. She was Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, wed in a strange turn of fate to Jaime Lannister. She had chosen this course no matter how improbable, and she would see it through. The following day brought a flurry of arrangements. Cersei's courtiers spread word that the crown, meaning Cersei's regency, would be calling upon the Westerland's lords to muster at Rosby and Stokeworth within a fortnight. From there, they would march northward. Gold cloaks circulated in the streets with proclamations, forging an unlikely sense of civic unity. The queen, whether they meant Daenerys or Cersei, ordered them to prepare. Fishmongers, tailors, and cobblers alike whispered about the monstrous captive in the Red Keep's courtyard. Some believed it was a demon Daenerys had conjured to frighten them. Others, that it was a sign of the Seven's wrath. Daenerys spent part of the morning in a dusty side chamber, writing letters to Sansa Stark, to Margaery Tyrell, and to the Martells in Dorne, informing them of Cersei's tentative support. Tyrion joined her in drafting these missives, ensuring the language was precise enough to reassure potential allies without giving away weaknesses. Afterwards, Daenerys sought an audience with Cersei once again, wishing to confirm final details about supply lines and routes. This time, Cersei received her in the throne room itself. The space felt colder than Daenerys remembered, the great columns draped in Lannister red. The Iron Throne loomed above, but Cersei did not sit upon it. Instead, she stood near it, flanked by Queensguard. Daenerys approached with two unsullied at her back, their presence a silent reminder of her own power. The floor's marble echoed under her boots. Cersei's expression was impassive as Daenerys explained that she would be leaving the city soon to return north. "My forces must be led," Daenerys said, voice clear. "The time for war councils in comfortable seats is ending. We need to be at the front lines." Cersei considered that, then inclined her head. "Very well. My generals and their bannermen will gather as promised. I have dispatched ravens to all relevant lords, instructing them to muster their men and rendezvous on the King's Road. If they fail to comply, they will be dealt with as traitors." Daenerys nodded. "I appreciate your cooperation. Let it not be said that House Lannister turned away from saving the realm." Cersei's lips curved in a thin smile, though her eyes held no warmth. "We'll see. Winter is a harsh teacher, Targaryen. When you face the dead in the cold fields outside Winterfell, perhaps you'll remember that the South has its own trials." Daenerys declined to take the bait. "We'll be waiting. Safe travels for your armies. And know that once this war is over, I intend to hold to our bargain." Cersei lifted her chin. "As do I." With that, Daenerys departed. Outside, in the courtyard, she found Jaime organizing a group of Lannister officers. She watched from a distance as he barked instructions about supply wagons, horse fodder, and the forging of dragonglass-tipped weapons. The men listened, some with uncertain expressions, but none dared openly challenge the Kingslayer. Daenerys noticed the difference in Jaime's posture, a kind of resolute purpose that had replaced the old arrogance he once wore like armor. This was a man who had lost illusions and found a cause that might redeem him. Tyrion appeared at her side. "It's almost time for us to depart, Your Grace," he said quietly. "The dragons will need feeding before we set off. I've arranged for a herd of goats. They're being brought to the field outside the Mudgate." Daenerys nodded, scanning the courtyard for Regal and Viserion. They were perched on the battlements above, tails swishing in mild impatience. A cluster of small folk had gathered on the far side of the courtyard, gaping up at the beasts. "Good," she said. The flight north won't be short. Will you speak with Jaime before we leave? She considered. Yes, I'll wait until he's finished briefing those officers. Her gaze lingered on Jaime. We might not see each other for some time, if Cersei decides to delay his departure. Tyrion tipped his head sympathetically. In that case, I'll make certain we're prepared to fly when you're ready. He departed, leaving Daenerys to cross the courtyard toward Jaime's group. A few of the Lannister officers glanced at her nervously, stepping aside. Jaime turned, noticing her approach. His expression softened a fraction. "Your Grace," he said in a neutral tone that belied the warmth in his eyes. Daenerys inclined her head, then looked to the cluster of men. "Continue your briefing," she said, taking a step back to indicate she would wait. Jaime finished rapidly, dismissing them with a curt command to gather inventories. Once they dispersed, he turned to her, an unspoken question on his face. "Are you leaving now?" "In a short while," she confirmed. "Tyrion and I must be in Winterfell soon. There's so much to finalize. I came to say farewell, and to remind you to be careful." She paused, dropping her voice. "I don't fully trust Cersei's motives." A shadow crossed his features. "Nor do I, but I'll handle it. When we come north, we'll bring the full might of House Lannister. One way or another." She allowed herself a small, private smile. "I look forward to that, and to seeing you in Winterfell." He glanced around to ensure no prying eyes lingered, then gently took her hand, pressing it between his own. The golden prosthetic felt hard and cool against her skin, while his good hand was warm. "I promise I won't let you down," he said quietly. "Or the realm." She squeezed his hand, then withdrew. "I know." She lifted her chin, adopting the regal bearing that befitted her station, and turned. Behind them, the caged wight remained in a guarded corner of the courtyard, still snarling and rattling its chains for all to see. Daenerys forced herself not to stare at the horror. That was a reminder of their mission's urgency. "Farewell, Jaime Lannister." He gave a faint bow. "Farewell, Daenerys Targaryen." She left, summoning the unsullied escort and finding Tyrion waiting by the main gates of the Red Keep. Rhaegal and Viserion had been fed, and they circled overhead, their roars sending tremors through the city. Tyrion mounted a horse. He preferred not to ride a dragon if he could avoid it, though he had done so in emergencies before. Daenerys, clad in a heavy cloak to guard against the wind chill, approached Rhaegal. The dragon lowered his head, allowing her to climb onto the saddle rig. She settled in, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that always came before flight. Tyrion's small band of riders would travel by road, aiming to make good time. Daenerys, however, did not wish to wait on horseback travel. Every day counted, and the dragons could fly swiftly. She gave Tyrion a final nod, then urged Rhaegal into the sky. Viserion followed in a burst of wings, and together, they soared above King's Landing, the rooftops shrinking below. Crowds craned their necks, watching as the dragons banked west, then north. Daenerys inhaled the rush of cold air, letting it fill her lungs and sharpen her senses. She cast one glance at the Red Keep, glimpsing Jaime's golden hair in the courtyard, a tiny speck from this height. Then she turned her gaze forward, focusing on the horizon. Winterfell beckoned. They flew for hours each day, stopping occasionally to let the dragons rest and hunt. Daenerys noticed how winter had spread further south than before. Snow dusted the high meadows, rivers bore thin sheets of ice along their edges, and farmland looked barren. The realm was bracing for the worst winter in a century. Every so often, she and Viserion circled overhead, scanning for signs of travelers or hazards. Near the Trident, she spotted a mass of figures moving along the roads. Some were refugees fleeing the cold, others were lords' retinues heading north to heed the call to arms. A sense of precarious unity hung over the land, as though each man realized that an unimaginable threat overshadowed their petty feuds. By the time Daenerys reached the outskirts of Winterfell 2 days later, she felt the sting of the biting winds that howled across the open fields. Even Rhaegal seemed restless, curling his wings tight to conserve heat. Viserion soared nearby, dark against the pewter sky. Below, Winterfell's walls appeared starker than ever, half buried in snowdrifts. Columns of smoke rose from chimneys, and Daenerys glimpsed the flicker of torches along the battlements. Her heart pounded with relief at the sight. The fortress was still standing, still bustling with defenders. She directed Rhaegal into a slow descent, landing in the courtyard that had been cleared for the dragon's use. Snow whipped around them, swirling in eddies. Guards rushed forward to greet her, including a cluster of Unsullied commanded by Grey Worm. She slid off Rhaegal's side, nearly slipping on the icy ground, but Grey Worm steadied her. Viserion circled overhead once before alighting in a corner of the courtyard, letting out a roar that rattled the very stones. Sansa Stark arrived moments later, wrapped in furs, face pale from the cold. She offered a stiff curtsy, her breath fogging in the air. "Your Grace, you've returned quickly. Did Cersei agree to help?" Daenerys nodded, catching her breath from the flight. "She did, surprisingly. She claims her armies will march in 2 weeks. Jaime stayed behind to ensure it happens." Sansa studied her, eyes flicking with a trace of skepticism. "Jaime Lannister is ensuring House Lannister keeps its word? The realm truly has changed." Daenerys almost smiled. "Yes, it has." She rubbed her numbed hands together. "Any news from the front? The undead?" Sansa's expression grew grave. "Yes, we've had more sightings. They've crossed the last river. According to Tormund's scouts, they may be upon us within a fortnight, if not sooner. The cold slows them, but they do not tire." A jolt of urgency shot through Daenerys. "We need to finalize our defenses right away." She glanced around. "Is Tyrion's staff here yet? I left him in King's Landing, but Missandei and Jorah should still be around." "They're in the Great Hall, finalizing the muster lists," Sansa said. "We also have new arrivals from the Vale. Some Knights of the Eyrie, though not as many as we'd hoped. They're uncertain about the claims of the dead. That wight you captured might have changed minds, but it's down in King's Landing." Daenerys felt a surge of frustration, but she swallowed it. "We'll persuade them through the accounts of Tormund and the others who have seen the undead. In the meantime, we must strengthen the perimeter." She paused, remembering the plan to use dragonglass on the battlements. "Have the blacksmiths finished forging dragonglass arrowheads and spears?" Sansa gestured for Daenerys to follow her. "Come inside, get warm. We can discuss it in detail." She led Daenerys toward the keep. Guards parted, letting them pass. The air in the entry hall felt marginally warmer, though Daenerys' cheeks still burned from the wind. They ascended the steps leading to the Great Hall, passing banners of House Stark and House Targaryen hung side by side. Despite the solemn circumstances, Daenerys felt a flicker of awe. A few years ago, such a sight would have seemed impossible. Inside, the Great Hall bustled with activity. Benches were set aside to make room for crates of dragonglass, barrels of salted provisions, and piles of thick wool cloaks. Daenerys spotted Missandei poring over a ledger with a maester, while Grey Worm conferred with a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing the sigil of House Glover. At the far end of the hall, Jorah Mormont spoke with Tormund Giantsbane, who gesticulated passionately. As Daenerys moved deeper into the hall, the hum of voices quieted momentarily as many turned to bow or kneel. She inclined her head, acknowledging them, and made her way to Jorah. He looked tired but resolute. The moment he saw her, he broke off his conversation and bowed. "Your Grace, you've arrived sooner than expected." "I flew," Daenerys replied, "and I bring news of Cersei's grudging support. Jaime Lannister is staying behind to ensure the Lannister troops march. We have maybe 2 weeks before the undead arrive." She glanced at Tormund, who wore a grave expression. "Or less if they push forward." Tormund snorted. "Won't be longer, that's for sure. The dead are unstoppable once they set their course. My people have seen them marching even through blizzards." Sansa joined them, speaking in a level tone. "Then we have to assume the siege begins in less than 2 weeks. That means finalizing every layer of defense." She turned to Daenerys. We've ringed the outer walls with sharpened stakes and covered them in dragonglass shards. The inner walls have scorpions and ballistae, though I'm not certain how effective they'll be if the whites swarm en masse. Our plan is to position archers on the battlements, armed with dragonglass arrows, while the cavalry, Dothraki and Vale Knights, will circle around to flank if any group of whites breaks through. Daenerys considered. Good. We need to also coordinate the dragons effectively. Drogon is still stabled outside Winterfell. Yes. Yora nodded. He's grown restless. He hunts miles away, but he returns each evening to roost near the encampment. The cold doesn't suit him, but he endures. Daenerys felt relief that her largest dragon was near. Then all three will be here for the battle. We'll use them to strafe the undead ranks with fire. But we must be wary of the White Walker's magic. We don't know what they can do to a dragon if they come close enough. Yora exchanged a look with Tormund. There are stories of them carrying spears of ice, able to shatter metal. I doubt even dragon scales are immune. If your dragon flies too low, it's at risk. Daenerys let out a slow breath. We'll keep them at a safe altitude whenever possible, only diving for targeted passes. She turned to Sansa. Have you heard any more from the Vale or from Marjorie Tyrell? Sansa nodded. The Vale sent knights, but not as many as we wanted. Lord Robert Arryn remains under Littlefinger's thumb, as you know. He's reluctant to send more men so far from the Eyrie without personal, undeniable proof. Marjorie Tyrell's forces are still en route, by all accounts. They may arrive just in time for the battle or possibly too late, depending on conditions on the Rose Road. She's moving heaven and earth to hurry, but the roads are icy, and many lords are slow. A pang of frustration shot through Daenerys. But she reminded herself that these logistical nightmares were inevitable in a realm battered by years of war. We'll prepare to fight with whoever stands here. If reinforcements arrive mid-battle, so much the better. From the side, Missandei approached, ledger in hand, offering Daenerys a warm look. Your Grace, we've tallied the food stores. If the battle lasts longer than a few days, we risk running short. We must be ready to evacuate non-combatants to the crypts or further south if the lines break. Lady Sansa has assigned some families to take refuge at the Glass Gardens, but it's not enough space for everyone. Daenerys recalled the crypts beneath Winterfell, ancient tunnels lined with the resting places of Stark forebears. They were not a fortress, but at least it would shield the weak from the initial onslaught. We'll do what we can. Prioritize women, children, and the elderly for the crypts. Everyone else must be prepared to fight if needed. The undead spare no one. The tension in the hall thickened at that reminder. Tormund grunted in agreement, swirling the cloak around his burly shoulders. We'll hold the perimeter as best we can, but they'll come at all hours, day and night. It won't be a single-pitched battle. It'll be waves, until we're all dead or they are. Sansa's expression grew resolute. Then let us finalize the watch rotations, the archer schedule, and who commands which section of the wall. Your Grace, you'll want to assign someone to coordinate the dragons while you rest or if you're forced to land. Daenerys nodded. Yora, you have commanded my armies before. Can you take on that role? He bowed his head. I'll do my best, Your Grace. They spent the rest of the day in a flurry of organization. Daenerys moved from the Great Hall to the courtyard and back again, inspecting the ramparts, conferring with blacksmiths forging dragonglass weapons, and speaking with the Dothraki Khalasar about the terrain. She found the Dothraki uneasy in the northern winter, but she tried to reassure them that their horses, at least, were being well fed on what hay the Crownlands had sent up before the roads froze. She also met with northern lords like Lord Glover, Lord Serwyn, and Lady Mormont, a fierce young girl who reminded Daenerys of her own youthful determination. Lady Mormont was especially blunt about their chances. We'll fight, we'll die if we must, but we won't kneel to these nightmares. Better to stand on our feet at Winterfell than to flee and be chased down like rabbits. Each passing hour hammered home the reality that the undead could arrive at any moment. Scouts on fast horses roamed beyond the winter-bitten fields, returning with grim tidings of whites seen in the distance, White Walkers glimpsed under the pale moonlight. Daenerys took to riding Drogon out in short scouting flights, accompanied by Regal or Viserion, scanning the snowy horizon for any sign of the advancing horde. The tension drew so tight that it felt like a string about to snap. For days later, on one such scouting flight, Daenerys saw them. It began as a ripple on the horizon, shapes trudging across the wastes, barely distinguishable from the snow at first. But as Drogon soared lower, she realized the shapes numbered in the thousands. And not just whites. She glimpsed the tall, gaunt figures of White Walkers leading them. Their eyes glowed with a cold, unholy light. The undead marched in loose formations, some wielding battered weapons, others just stumbling forward with the mindless hunger for living flesh. She urged Drogon to climb higher, not wanting to draw too close. A swirl of wind battered them, and she felt a pang of dread. Even from her vantage, she saw the front line span the breadth of a wide valley, dragging behind it a monstrous tail of corpses. If one horde contained this many, how many more might lurk beyond? She returned to Winterfell in haste, landing in the courtyard with snow billowing around Drogon's black wings. The moment her boots hit the ground, she summoned Sansa, Jorah, Tormund, and the other commanders. They're within a day's march, she informed them. Possibly less if they press on through the night. We must be ready. The news spread through the fortress like wildfire. Horns sounded, summoning men to their posts. The gates were shut, barricades reinforced. Large braziers were set along the walls, ready to be lit to provide the archers with better visibility. The dragons took position in the skies overhead, occasionally touching down to rest. Grey Worm organized the Unsullied in tight phalanxes near the main gate. Dothraki outriders patrolled the open fields, though many would soon be forced to retreat behind the walls. Missandei oversaw the hurried movement of the most vulnerable into the crypts. Children cried. Mothers comforted them. Fear hung in the air like a chill deeper than the winter wind. Daenerys stood on the battlements beside Sansa, looking out at the snowy plains under the twilight sky. The sun was setting, and soon the undead might be upon them in darkness. Torchlight flickered, casting long shadows across the white drifts. Sansa wore a grim mask of determination. My people have faced harsh winters before, she said quietly. But never this. Never an army of the dead. Daenerys touched Sansa's first-swathed shoulder lightly. We'll face it together. Sansa nodded. Yes. She paused, then added, Your Grace, thank you. For coming here, for uniting the realm as best you could. We might never have stood a chance otherwise. Daenerys accepted the gratitude with a nod. She glanced at the sky, half expecting to see a flight of dragons. And yes, she spotted Drogon's dark shape circling to the north, scanning for the enemy's approach. The real test starts now, Daenerys whispered, and so the final hours of waiting began. Soldiers crowded every parapet, their breath billowing into the cold air. Nervous laughter, hushed prayers, and the occasional brash boast passed between men. The Dothraki painted their araks with dragonglass resin, hoping it would help them cleave through the dead. The Unsullied stood in disciplined ranks, spears at the ready. Northern archers strung bows with gloved hands, testing the tension. Wagons carrying barrels of dragonfire, an alchemical mixture reminiscent of wildfire but refined by Tyrion's cunning, were stationed at key choke points. Tyrion himself had not yet arrived from King's Landing, leaving Daenerys to rely on Jorah and Missandei for counsel. They would do their best, but she regretted losing Tyrion's quick mind for the opening moves of the battle. Night fell swiftly. A sliver of moon provided faint light. Lanterns were lit along the walls, and the wind seemed to die for a moment, as though holding its breath in anticipation. Daenerys took up a position near the top of the gatehouse. Regal perched on a rampart beside her, snarling quietly. She had decided Drogon would remain aloft, patrolling, while Regal stayed at the fortress so she could direct him personally. Viserion circled overhead too, a pale streak against the gloom. Then, from the distance, came a low moan carried on the wind, a sound so inhuman and layered that Daenerys felt it in her bones. The men on the wall went stiff. Another moan and another until it became a cacophony. Jorah, standing nearby, muttered, "They're here." Tormund raised his sword, eyes narrowed as he peered into the darkness. Soon, the first shapes emerged, dark silhouettes stumbling across the snowy field, the reflection of torchlight revealing shreds of flesh clinging to bones, tattered skin pulled taut over blackened limbs. Whites, they advanced in a loose wave thousands thick. At their rear, just barely visible in the flicker of flames, loomed the pale forms of the White Walkers on undead horses. No horns were sounded by the enemy. There was only that ghastly moan and the crunch of snow under countless feet. A hush fell across Winterfell's defenders. Daenerys felt her heart hammering as she signaled to the archers. "Steady," she called out. "Wait for them to close." And now, a flurry of arrows hissed from the walls, each tipped with dragonglass. The front ranks of the Whites stumbled as shafts pierced them, some collapsing to the ground. But those behind clambered over the fallen, shrieking or hissing in mindless fury. Another volley soared, felling more, yet still they came. The wave of undead pressed forward, unstoppable in its sheer weight of numbers. Daenerys turned to Regal. "Dracarys," she shouted, pointing toward the densest cluster. The green dragon opened his jaws and unleashed a torrent of flame that lit the night like a sunrise. Fire roiled over the Whites, incinerating dozens, their shrieks echoing. A ragged cheer went up from the defenders. But as the flames receded, more Whites clambered past the charred bodies, unstoppable in their grim determination. Beneath the moonlight, Daenerys saw the White Walkers raise slender spears of ice. Her stomach twisted. With a ripple of malice, one of the walkers hurled a spear. It streaked through the air, trailing frost. Regal roared and dodged aside at Daenerys's urgent tug on his reins, the spear whistling past. It crashed into the battlements below, exploding in a shower of ice shards. Several men were thrown back, howling in pain. "Brace yourselves," Yora shouted, drawing his sword. He called to the unsullied lines. "Hold! Hold!" The Whites reached the sharpened stakes around the outer perimeter. Some were impaled, but others clambered over their fallen brethren. A savage melee erupted as the first wave struck the Unsullied's front rank. Dragonglass spears lunged forward, skewering Whites. The Dothraki cavalry thundered out from a side gate, slicing through a flank of the undead. For a moment, Daenerys glimpsed the silver curve of Arrak's flashing in torchlight, the strong silhouettes of horses rearing. Yet the Whites swarmed, pulling riders from the saddle, ripping them apart in the snow. Screams mingled with the unearthly moans of the dead. Arrows rained from the walls, but it was impossible to discern friend from foe amid the chaos. Daenerys urged Regal to unleash another blast of fire, scorching a path through the undead. Corpses ignited, thrashing in flames before crumbling to ash. She guided him to strafe the lines, but she had to watch for the White Walkers' ice spears. Several soared upward, and only her frantic commands kept Regal from being skewered. Some of the Whites, ablaze yet still moving, flung themselves at the battlements, igniting portions of the wooden barriers. Daenerys shouted for water, but the defenders were too busy battling. Grey Worm's calm voice rose above the din, directing the Unsullied to tighten their formation. She caught glimpses of Tormund in the melee, swinging a massive axe, bellowing curses at the dead. On the other side, Lady Mormont's small figure clashed with the Whites relentlessly, her bannermen rallying around her. Daenerys's breath came in sharp gasps. The stench of burning flesh filled her nostrils. She tried to keep track of how many Whites they had destroyed, but it was like counting grains of sand in a storm. She felt a spike of alarm. Where was Drogon? She scanned the night sky, eventually spotting him circling above, unleashing plumes of fire on the undead rear ranks. Viserion soared beside him, banked to avoid a volley of ice spears. The White Walkers were hurling them with unnerving accuracy, each spear bursting into shards of freezing mist on impact. An earth-shaking roar drew her attention to the main gate. The Whites had overrun the stake lines, and hundreds were now pouring toward the walls, scrabbling at the stone. The gates groaned under their collective weight, even as the defenders poured flaming oil down from the murder holes. Jorah Mormont and a cluster of northern warriors raced to hold a barricade, slashing at any white that broke through. Sparks, screams, and rotting limbs flailed in every direction. Daenerys felt her heart clench. The tide was relentless. The living fought valiantly, but for every white slain, another took its place. And the White Walkers themselves had not even joined the melee yet. They stood behind, controlling the horde with icy gazes. Suddenly, one of them rode forward on a pale horse, raising a long blade of ice. A wave of unnatural cold radiated outward. Men stiffened, ice forming on their beards, and the whites surged with renewed ferocity. "Dracarys!" Daenerys screamed, directing Rhaegal to target the White Walker. The dragon's flame poured down, but at the last moment, the walker lifted its sword. A swirl of frost deflected part of the fire, and the walker urged its undead steed aside. Some whites were immolated, but the walker survived. Daenerys's rage flared. These creatures were cunning. On the walls, archers continued to loose arrows. Some found their mark, felling whites in mid-lunge. Others struck wide in the confusion. Daenerys watched in horror as a group of undead formed a grisly ramp of corpses, clambering over each other to scale the wall. The defenders stabbed down, hacking limbs, but the wave kept coming. A wildling pitched forward with a scream, pulled off the battlement by grasping claws. "Fall back to the inner wall," Tormund roared, seeing part of the perimeter buckle. Men retreated, dragging wounded with them, leaving behind a sea of corpses, both white and living. But the whites pressed relentlessly. If the defenders lost the courtyard, the fortress might become a tomb for everyone inside. The battle raged on into the night. Daenerys lost track of time, consumed by the chaos. She guided Rhaegal from vantage to vantage, trying to torch the largest clusters of undead. Below, the snow glowed orange with fire. Screams reverberated off the walls, and the clang of steel against ice-laden flesh pounded her ears. Whenever she glimpsed a White Walker, she tried to direct her dragon's fire at it, but they seemed unnaturally swift, always moving away before the flames could envelop them. At one point, Daenerys spotted a group of whites smashing at a side gate that led toward the crypts. She realized with icy dread that if the whites found a way into the tunnels, the non-combatants would be slaughtered. Signaling to Jorah, she dove Rhaegal down to that corridor. Jorah and a handful of Unsullied raced after her. They reached the gate in time to see the heavy wooden beams cracking under the assault of half a dozen undead. Daenerys dismounted Rhaegal, pressing her palm to the dragon's flank. "Rhaegal Dracarys," she hissed, pointing to the gate. But whites were already slipping through a gap in the splintered door. Jorah barreled forward, cutting them down with his dragonglass sword. The creatures hissed and shrank back, but more pressed from behind. With a roar, Rhaegal unleashed a spout of flame that washed over them, turning them to ash. A wave of scorching heat fanned across Daenerys' face. The door itself caught fire, crackling. She coughed, eyes stinging from the smoke, but the whites at the gate were momentarily repulsed. "You must hold this point," she told Jorah, her voice harsh. "No matter what." Jorah nodded. "Go. Keep fighting from the skies." He locked eyes with her for an instant, then turned to rally the Unsullied, shouting, "Form up! Spears at the ready!" Daenerys climbed back onto Rhaegal, her gloves slippery with sweat and soot. The dragon's body rippled beneath her, tense with battle fury. Rising into the air once more, she surveyed the courtyard. Much of it was wreathed in flames, but whites still poured in from collapsed sections of the outer walls. The living had retreated to a smaller perimeter around the Great Hall and the main keep. Above them, Drogon and Viserion circled, but Daenerys realized with a pang of alarm that Drogon was flying unsteadily, a black shaft of ice jutting from his right flank. He roared, thrashing. A White Walker had scored a hit. "No," Daenerys breathed. She urged Rhaegal to fly closer, but an ice spear whistled past, forcing them to veer off. Drogon descended abruptly near the Godswood, swiping his tail at the ground in pain. If the White Walkers targeted him again, they might bring him down. Desperation flooded Daenerys. She needed to help Drogon, but the Whites and White Walkers were everywhere. In a split second, she spotted the White Walker who had thrown the spear, tall, clad in pale armor, mounted on a skeletal horse. Summoning her nerve, Daenerys directed Rhaegal into a steep dive, ignoring the pounding of her heart. "Dracarys!" she screamed, voice ragged. This time, the walker was not quick enough to dodge. Rhaegal's flames roared over it, engulfing horse and rider in a conflagration of greenish-orange fire. The walker shrieked, its icy flesh cracking. For an instant, it looked as though it might repel the flames with a swirl of frost, but the dragonfire overwhelmed it. The creature shattered into shards of ice, vanishing like dust in the wind. The undead steed collapsed into chunks of frozen bone. A circle of whites nearby crumpled as well, presumably those it directly controlled. A pocket of the courtyard cleared momentarily. Daenerys felt triumph surge in her chest. The White Walkers could be destroyed. "We can win," she whispered to herself, adrenaline coursing. But the cost had already been high. She swung her gaze to Ard the Godswood, where Drogon still struggled. Dozens of whites converged on his flank, crawling over his wounded scales. Viserion dived to help, bathing them in blue-tinted flame. Meanwhile, more whites continued to scale the battered walls, pressing the defenders back. Atop the ramparts, northern archers fought hand-to-hand as their ammunition ran low. The courtyard was a rolling tide of flesh and fire. Daenerys glimpsed Tormund with blood streaming down his temple, still hacking away at every undead shape that approached. Lady Mormont led a group of shield maidens near the stables, driving back whites with resolute ferocity. A shriek sounded from above. Another White Walker flung an ice spear at Viserion. The dragon banked sharply, avoiding a direct hit but taking a glancing blow along the wing. Viserion howled, losing altitude. Daenerys cursed under her breath, twisting Rhaegal around to retaliate. She unleashed another torrent of flame, but the White Walker dodged behind a group of whites. The courtyard was too crowded with friend and foe to strike freely without risking friendly fire. "Retreat to the keep," Grey Worm's voice thundered. The outer defenses were nearly overwhelmed, whites pouring through multiple breaches. The living had no choice but to fall back again. Daenerys recognized the risk. Once forced inside, there would be scant room to maneuver her dragons. They needed an open field to maximize dragonfire. But the whites were like a relentless wave. She made a decision. "Rhaegal, land near Drogon," she commanded. The green dragon responded, descending in a swirl of snow and ash. Whites scurried in the gloom, but Daenerys swung from the saddle, ignoring the spike of fear in her gut. She ran across the slick ground to Drogon, whose flank bled blackish rivulets of dragon blood from the embedded spear. The beast roared at her approach, half delirious with pain. She pressed a hand to his side, whispering soothing words in Valyrian. Whites hissed nearby, but Viserion's flame soared overhead, torching them. Rhaegal bellowed, stomping his claws to flatten the whites that scuttled too close. With trembling fingers, Daenerys gripped the ice spear lodged in Drogon's scales, trying to pull it free. The cold radiating from it was unnatural, stinging her palms even through her gloves. Drogon roared and writhed, nearly knocking her aside. She clenched her teeth, tugging with all her might. At last, the spear came loose in a burst of crackling frost. Drogon groaned, smoke rising from his jaws. Blood oozed from the wound, sizzling as it met the bitter cold air. "There," Daenerys gasped, tossing the spear aside. "Now you can fly." The black dragon's eyes, each as big as a shield, fixed on her, reflecting pain and rage. Suddenly, a new surge of whites broke past the defenders, rushing toward Daenerys and her dragons. She spun, searching for a weapon, but she only had a small dragonglass dagger at her belt. Rhaegal belched fire from the other side, trying to keep them at bay, but there were too many. She felt a spike of terror. If the dragons were pinned down, it would be the end. A horn blast cut through the night, The gates to the south of the courtyard burst open. Through the swirl of snow and flame, Daenerys glimpsed shapes on horseback charging forward with lances lowered. At their head rode Tyrion Lannister, of all people, flanked by Margaery Tyrell in gleaming armor. Behind them streamed an entire host bearing the golden rose of Highgarden, the red and gold lion of the Lannisters loyal to Tyrion, and the falcon of the Vale. More horns answered, echoing across the battlefield. Reinforcements had arrived. The new arrivals slammed into the flank of the Whites, cutting a bloody swath. Archers from the Vale peppered the undead with arrows, while Tyrell cavalry crashed into them, dragging them from behind. Tyrion, mounted on a sturdy warhorse, jabbed at the Whites with a dragon-glass-tipped lance, face set in grim determination. The assault diverted enough of the undead that Daenerys had a moment to catch her breath. She rushed to Drogon's neck, speaking in urgent Valyrian. "Fly, my love. Fly, fight if you can." Drogon huffed, laboring to rise, but once he gathered his strength, he flapped his massive wings, dislodging more Whites. Slowly, he rose into the air, lashing his tail and unleashing a roar that shook the walls. Rhaegal joined him, both dragons climbing skyward. Viserion circled overhead, still favoring his injured wing, but regaining altitude. The cavalry in the courtyard seized the moment, pressing the advantage. Margaery Tyrell led a charge, her hair braided tight beneath a gleaming helm, her face set with fierce resolve. She shouted commands, rallying her men to push the Whites back. Tyrion spotted Daenerys across the carnage and inclined his head in recognition, though he had no time for words. The undead snapped and clawed at the new attackers, but the living had caught them off guard, and the surprise was critical. Still, the White Walkers at the rear were not idle. One of them raised its blade, an eerie keening sound emanating. Another wave of Whites lurched forward from a side approach, threatening to envelop the cavalry. Margaery's forces wheeled, but they risked being flanked. Seeing this, Daenerys clambered back onto Rhaegal, ignoring the ache in her muscles and the reek of blood and fire. She guided the dragon upward, scanning for the densest cluster of Whites. "There!" she shouted, pointing Rhaegal's snout at the undead mob. Once more, she roared, "Dracarys!" This time, the flame carved a wide arc across the courtyard, incinerating dozens upon dozens of Whites. They fell in heaps, the snow turning to slush under the heat. The path cleared for Margaery's cavalry to wheel about, forming a new line. They crashed into another group of the undead, smashing them aside. Tyrion's archers unleashed volley after volley of dragonglass arrows. All around, the fortress rang with the chaos of war. Men shouting, dragons roaring, Whites screaming, steel clashing, and the infernal hiss of ice spears. But with the arrival of reinforcements, the living now had momentum, pressing the undead from multiple fronts. Slowly, the tide began to shift. The defenders who had been pushed back rallied, using the sudden surge to reclaim ground. Tormund unleashed a guttural victory roar as he cleaved through a White's head. Grey Worm reformed the unsullied lines to corral the undead. High in the sky, Drogon, though wounded, rained flame on the White Walkers' position. One by one, the Pale Riders were either forced back or incinerated. Some evaded total destruction, retreating toward the fringes. Each time a White Walker fell, a portion of the Whites collapsed, severed from the necromantic link. The masses of dead began to thin, leaving heaps of unmoving corpses behind. Hours passed like minutes in the frenzy of battle. By the time the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the living had driven the Whites from Winterfell's courtyard and outer walls. The scattered undead fled into the darkness, pursuing the last surviving White Walkers. Daenerys directed Rhaegal in pursuit, but the White Walkers vanished into a freezing fog, leaving only the battered remnants of their horde behind. The courtyard was a charnel house. Corpses of men and Whites lay in tangled mounds, steam rising from the pools of blood. Sections of the walls were blackened by fire, barricades splintered, and entire towers had collapsed. The living stood in exhausted clusters, many gravely wounded. Daenerys landed Rhaegal near the Great Hall, sliding from the saddle. Soot caked her face. Her ears rang with the echoes of combat, and her limbs trembled from exhaustion and cold. She nearly stumbled, but a strong arm caught her. She looked up into Yora's eyes, relief flooding her. "You're alive," he breathed. "We held, thanks to the reinforcements." She gripped his arm, glancing around. "Where is Tyrion?" "Over there by the stables," Yora said, nodding. He arrived at the last moment with Marjorie's host. They turned the tide. Daenerys saw Tyrion, leaning against a fallen timber, breathing heavily, his once neat hair matted with blood. Nearby, Marjorie Tyrell removed her helm, revealing soot-streaked features. She was speaking to Tormund, who gestured with excitement. The living had won a victory, but at a staggering price. Daenerys swallowed, scanning the wreckage for any sign of Sansa. At last, she spotted Sansa standing beside Lady Mormont's battered shield maidens, exhausted but alive, directing a group of survivors to douse remaining fires and rescue the wounded. Relief swept through Daenerys at the sight. Another thought struck her. Where was Arya Stark? But in the chaos, she could not see the young woman. She could only hope she was unhurt. Dragging her gaze upward, Daenerys spied Drogon limping onto one of the walls. The ice wound in his flank, slowly oozing blood. Viserion circled overhead, obviously injured but still flying. Rhaegal lay down behind her, panting smoke. The dragons had paid a price for their role, but they had survived. She brushed a trembling hand along Rhaegal's snout, whispering, "Thank you, brave one." Here, in the pale dawn light, Daenerys realized that the undead had not been completely annihilated. Some White Walkers had escaped, presumably with part of their horde. But for now, Winterfell stood. The living had reclaimed the fortress, if only barely. Bodies littered the courtyard, the stench of death thick. Groans of the dying mingled with the crackle of dying fires. Tyrion approached, face drawn. He inclined his head. "Your Grace, I'm sorry for arriving so late. The roads were frozen, and we had to convince half the lords to move faster. But we made it just in time." She clasped his forearm. "You saved us. Thank you, Tyrion." Her voice quivered with emotion. He managed a tired smile. "We can exchange thanks later. For now, we must see to the wounded, check for whites still lurking in the corners, and prepare for another assault in case the undead return." Daenerys closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her. "Yes, you're right." She forced herself to stand straighter. "And we must find out if there are more White Walkers gathering. This was but one battle." A hush fell as the weight of that realization settled in. They had driven the undead from Winterfell, but the war was far from over. The White Walkers might regroup or might strike elsewhere. And somewhere to the south, Cersei Lannister was mustering an army, ostensibly to join the fight, but possibly with her own schemes in mind. Yet, for this moment the living had endured. In the courtyard, Dothraki dismounted to clasp forearms with northern warriors, forging a bond in shared survival. The Vale Knights trudged among the fallen, pulling out wounded men. Tormund hoisted a battered wildling to his feet, shouting about how they'd earned a barrel of ale. Marjorie Tyrell conferred with Sansa, each woman placing a supportive hand on the other's shoulder. A fragile camaraderie rippled through the battered remnants of the allied forces, a sense that they had faced death and snatched victory from its jaws. Standing in the swirling ash and snow, Daenerys took a moment to breathe. The dawn sky glowed faintly pink, a color of renewal. Her dragons, though wounded, still roared defiance. Her allies, though battered, still stood. Perhaps, just perhaps, the living had a chance to turn back the long night. Her thoughts flicked to Jaime Lannister, still in King's Landing, presumably gathering the Lannister forces. Would he arrive in time to aid in the final blow against the White Walkers? Or would Cersei's betrayal manifest when the realm needed her armies most? She could not know. But she clung to faith in Jaime's promise. So many questions and so many dead. Daenerys scanned the torn courtyard once more, feeling tears burn behind her eyes for the men and women who would never see another sunrise. She lifted her chin, steeling herself. Another day had come, and she remained the mother of dragons, the queen who had striven to unite the 7 kingdoms against the greatest threat they had ever known. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but she would walk it. No, she would fly it, until the last wight was destroyed or she perished in the attempt. Within her chest, her heart beat with the rhythm of dragon wings, and in the rising dawn light over the blood-soaked snow, Daenerys Targaryen stood unbowed, the living's banner against the coming night.